Chapter 352. Jean Wan covered her aching belly with her hand, and her eyes gradually turned red. If she jumped like this, even if she didn't die, she would be hurt, not to mention she was pregnant. The other party really gave her a big problem. Jean Wan, why are you sitting here? Stop the car. Why don't you stop the car? Several cars passed by at a strange speed, making people panic. Su Shui screamed from behind, "Are you trying to kill me? Stop the car. Get out of the car if you want to live. This car can't be stopped." Jean Wan didn't bother to explain too much to her. She raised her hand and tried the car doors. As expected, they were all locked. Fortunately, the car was on land and not under water pressure. If there was no water pressure, she could use a sharp object to break the car window. Jean Wan knocked Su Shui's high-heeled shoes on the car window several times. Her arms, which had been a little numb, were almost powerless now. She changed her hands to knock on the car window. In the end, she put on the high-heeled shoes that were a size larger than her feet, turned sideways on the seat, and kicked the car window hard with her foot. "What are you doing?" Su Shui looked at her strange actions blankly. "Don't talk so much nonsense." Jean Wan kicked the car window and turned to look at her. "If you want to live, come and help me open the car window." Su Shui shrank her neck. She didn't believe Jean Wan at all. The banging sound in the car made her even more panicked. Suddenly, she saw the fruit knife abandoned on the ground, picked it up, and pointed it at Jean Wan again. "If you don't stop the car quickly, I'll kill you now." Jean Wan glanced at her coldly and grabbed the fruit knife. Ignoring Su Shui's increasingly panicked and crazed eyes, she got up, put the fruit knife in the gap between the car window and the car door, and then smashed it with her high heels. Su Shui's eyes were cold. The car window was too strong. No wonder the other party had specially bought a new car to set up such a big conspiracy. All the windows of the new car basically had a smash-proof function. Jean Wan gritted her teeth and pulled out the metal bar on the passenger seat to knock on the window as she and Mo Jingshan had done when they had escaped underwater. The car window was damaged one after another, and finally there was a gap. Jean Wan slashed it again, cut open the seal with a fruit knife, and smashed it with her shoe until the whole car window was broken and fell down. Jean Wan lay on the car window and observed the wasteland on both sides of the highway. Ahead of her was a sunken hill. There was no water, and it was barren. She didn't know where it was. At a speed of 150 miles per hour, the moment the car window was opened, a gust of wind rushed in. Jean Wan narrowed her eyes and looked around. Suddenly, she turned and said, "Su Shui, come here." Su Shui's face was filled with fear as the strong wind blew in, and she shook her head vigorously. Jean Wan lost her patience and reached out to tug at her. "Your cousin wants to harm you. Are you really going to let her have her way? Although we might get hurt, we have to jump to survive." "Jump? I don't want it. I'll definitely die if I jump at this speed. You really want to harm me?" Su Shui screamed and pushed her. Jean Wan tugged her hard. Since she couldn't reason with her, she had to use force. Just as the two of them were fighting, Jean Wan suddenly seemed to hear the sound of a siren. She turned her head abruptly and looked at the wires under the seat. The siren sounded frightening. She tightened her grip and pulled Su Shui to the open window. "Jump." "I don't want to jump." The two of them kept fighting, and Jean Wan couldn't divert her attention to the huge truck that had been following this car. Su Shui was almost pushed out by Jean Wan again and again. She didn't know where the brute force came from, but she suddenly grabbed Jean Wan's neck and forced Jean Wan to let go of her. Then she turned over and pressed Jean Wan hard against the car door. Her eyes were red as she strangled Jean Wan's neck and shouted, "If you want to die, die by yourself. Don't drag me. Go to hell, you." Jean Wan was shocked to see the hatred in Su Shui's eyes. She wanted to wake her up, but her face was red and she couldn't speak. Just as she was about to be pushed out of the car window by Su Shui, half of Jin Wan's body was exposed outside the window. Out of the corner of her eye, she finally saw the huge truck that had been following closely behind, and at the same time, she saw the black Bentley speeding up behind it. Bentley? A black Bentley? At this angle and speed, she couldn't see the license plate clearly, but the model of the car was so familiar to her that she frowned hard. Just as she was distracted, Su Shui pushed her out with force. Jin Wan's back brushed against the remaining glass fragments of the car window. The pain made her lose the strength to resist. The moment she was pushed out, with the inertia of the speeding car and the speed at which she was thrown, she felt as if she was flying for 2 seconds and then fell heavily to the ground. At the moment of falling, Jin Wan subconsciously covered her stomach with her hand, but her body rolled several times on the ground. Her limbs and bones were in so much pain that she almost lost consciousness. Almost at the same time, the huge truck rushed straight in her direction and even sped up. Hearing the sound, Jin Wan raised her head with a jerk and looked at the huge truck that was about to rush towards her. The truck was coming straight for her. Even the escape route of jumping out of the car had been blocked. She didn't even have the last chance of survival. Despair and panic swamped her in an instant. At this critical moment, the black Bentley several meters behind the huge truck suddenly sped up. At the moment when Jin Wan was about to be run over by the truck, the black Bentley rushed into her sight at an astonishing speed and decisively stood between her and the truck. Boom! There was a loud bang. In a trance, Jin Wan seemed to see the license plate number of the black Bentley rushing over, and a string in her brain snapped with the loud crash. Don't! Jin Wan's body was thrown to the side of the road by the impact of the 2 cars in front of her. After rolling several times, she couldn't control her body and hit hard against the safety fence on the side of the highway. She felt as if her abdomen was being torn apart, and waves of pain assaulted her. The cars in the rear slammed on the brakes one after another because of the terrible accident in front of them. With a series of braking sounds, the world seemed to fall silent for an instant. Jin Wan raised her eyes with some difficulty and looked at the black Bentley that was almost hit by the huge truck. Chapter 353. Jin Wan's entire body trembled in pain. Her heart felt empty. She stared at the car, her hands struggling to crawl on the ground, but no matter how hard she tried, she could not move. The sharp, throbbing pain in her abdomen stimulated her nerves. Jingshan, in the distance, there was a loud explosion. There was no need to guess to know that the car Su Shui was in had self-ignited and exploded. The fire and thick black smoke covered the sky with a layer of fog. The highway was suddenly quiet and suffocating, and the smell of death slowly penetrated Jin Wan's skin. Her tense and disordered nerves cooled down bit by bit, but she felt cold and bone-chilling. Jin Wan had never felt the sky was so gloomy. The black Bentley stopped there motionlessly, and the gasoline under the car sprang up a small fire. Jin Wan stared at the fire, gritted her teeth, and tried desperately to crawl over to put out the fire, but after a long time, she only moved a few centimeters forward. Mrs. M.O. Fong Ling's voice followed. A lot of drivers had gathered behind the giant truck. She quickly pushed the crowd away and ran in. When she saw Jin Wan lying on the ground with red eyes, she rushed over. Fong Ling crouched down to help Jin Wan up, but Jin Wan kept staring at the black Bentley and said hoarsely, "Who is the person in the car? Let me help you up first." Fong Ling almost never cried. Now seeing Jin Wan's blank eyes and the blood oozing from her lower body, her eyes almost turned red. She stepped forward and tried to help her up, but Jin Wan couldn't even stand steadily and just kept staring at the car. "Tell me, who is the person in the car?" Fong Ling gritted her teeth and didn't speak. Jin Wan slowly turned her eyes to Fong Ling. "Is it Mo Jingshan?" Fong Ling grabbed her arm to prevent her from falling, but her hand holding her arm trembled slightly. She tried to comfort her, but she couldn't suppress her emotions at all. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "Mr. Mo, and we have tracked your location and chased you all the way. We were half an hour behind you and finally caught up with you as fast as we could, but just now, when we saw you being pushed out of the car window, Mr. Mo's car suddenly accelerated to the limit. Jean Wan's mind went blank for a moment. The person in the car was Mo Jingshan. The moment her consciousness stopped, Jean Wan suddenly pushed Feng Ling away, turned around, and staggered in the direction of the car. Feng Ling didn't expect that she still had the strength to push herself away and stepped back. When she reached out to help her, Jean Wan had already rushed to the side of the black Bentley. She rushed forward to hold Jean Wan, who almost knelt on the ground, and held her arm tightly. "Mrs. Mo, don't do this." Jean Wan stared at the motionless Bentley in front of her and couldn't hear anything. Nanheng, who rushed into the crowd almost at the same time as Feng Ling, didn't say a word and directly asked Kay and the others to catch the driver of the giant truck. At the same time, a group of people were solemnly preparing to rescue him. The driver's around. And they pointed. In. And did the car in front explode? Did you? Is it too scary? Look, the car and. MOG said. Shen. And. She have a handshake, I to say. To say, and. The car is leaking oil. Look, the oil is on fire. Will this car explode too? The whispers of the crowd couldn't reach Jean Wan's ears. She held back her tears and stared at the broken window with bloodshot eyes. She tried to push Feng Ling away, but Feng Ling still held her arm tightly and finally hugged Jean Wan with both hands. "Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Let me go." "Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling, let me go." Jean Wan screamed. "Let me go, this car may spontaneously combust at any time. Mr. Mo risked his life to rush here and block the way just to save your life. No matter what happens to Mr. Mo, if you don't leave now, won't Mr. Mo's sacrifice be in vain?" "Sacrifice what? How could he be sacrificed?" "He won't." Jean Wan struggled crazily in her arms and finally couldn't move. Hearing the sound of Nanheng and Feng Ling trying to open the door, she couldn't hold back her tears and knelt to the ground powerlessly. "Jean Wan." Feng Ling couldn't help calling her name. She lowered her head and saw Jean Wan's trembling and twitching shoulders. She held her shoulders and said calmly, "Your lower body is covered with blood. Get in the car first." "Jean Wan, don't be like this." Seeing the fire on the gasoline under the car getting bigger and bigger, Jean Wan wanted to go up and put it out. Nanheng suddenly looked at Jean Wan and said seriously, "Feng Ling, take Jean Wan away immediately." It was necessary to take Jean Wan away. With Nanheng's order, Feng Ling forced Jean Wan up from the ground, put her arms around her shoulders, and took her hand. "Let's go." Jean Wan didn't speak or move. She just stared at the black Bentley and watched the blood spreading out along the door. She felt dizzy. "Mo Jingshan, come out, come out." Jean Wan's mind was blank. She unconsciously walked to the car door but was held down by Feng Ling. She stared blankly at the deformed car door. The airbag of a Bentley is better than that of many cars. "He'll be fine, right?" Jean Wan seemed to be talking to Feng Ling, but also seemed to be talking to the person in the car, and more like talking to herself. Feng Ling didn't say anything. No matter how good the car was, it was driven at the limit of its speed. If it was an ordinary car at this speed, it would have been smashed into pieces in an instant. The huge impact was not something a normal person could bear. Besides, Mr. Mo drove the car horizontally, and the side of the car was hit. The defense of the side was not as strong as that of the front and back of the car, so the situation inside the car was obviously no better than outside. It could only be worse than what they saw. At the moment when Jean Wan was almost crushed to death by the giant truck, Mr. Mo used his life to exchange for Jean Wan's. Just now, when he suddenly drove the car to the limit, no one could see this scene. Even though Feng Ling had been through fire and water for so many years and was used to death, she still couldn't forget the scene just now. Feng Ling held Jean Wan's hand, pulled her over, and was about to take her away. In fact, Jean-Wan didn't have much strength, and the red and sticky lower body made her realize what she had lost at this moment. Why did this happen? Why did it suddenly become like this? Chapter 354. Feng Ling forcibly took Jean-Wan back to the black SUV not far behind. As soon as she opened the door, there was a sudden noise. It sounded like the deformed car door was finally opened. Hearing the noise, Jean-Wan froze, turned her eyes in that direction with a jerk, and turned to walk back. Jean-Wan, don't go over there. Mo Jingshan is there. I heard them open the car door. Feng Ling held her and didn't let her move. In this situation, Mr. Mo was probably covered in blood. If Jean-Wan went over in this state, she would probably suffer a big blow. Feng Ling, let me go over. Jean-Wan. I beg you. Jean-Wan finally could not hold it in any longer. She choked with sobs, and large drops of tears rolled down her battered and blood-stained face. She stared stubbornly in that direction. Let me go see him. I want to go see him. Feng Ling made up her mind and pulled Jean-Wan back with force. Jean-Wan's whole body bumped into her arms. Feng Ling was about to help her into the car when Jean-Wan's whole body suddenly softened and she fell down. Jean-Wan. Feng Ling was startled and rushed to hold her steady. Fearing that something really happened to her, she helped her into the car. When she looked down and saw the blood on Jean-Wan's lower body, she hurriedly took off her black coat and wrapped it around her lower body. Then she quickly contacted the nearest rescue team and emergency center. Feng Ling watched Jean-Wan being pushed out of the car. A normal person would be hurt after being pushed out of a car at such a speed, let alone Jean-Wan's stomach. Feng Ling didn't dare to think anymore. She held the phone in one hand and held Jean-Wan's hand tightly with the other, but only felt a bone-chilling coldness. Jean-Wan's blood seemed to be frozen. From her hands to her face to her neck, she was cold everywhere. She was still frowning in her coma and murmuring indistinctly. Listening carefully, she seemed to be calling Mo Jingshan's name. When Jean-Wan woke up, she thought she just had a nightmare, but as soon as she moved, she felt pain all over, as if all her bones and flesh had been taken apart and reassembled. For a moment, she almost suspected that her rebirth was fake. Perhaps she had just returned to the despair and pain 10 years later. She stared blankly at the snow-white walls and ceiling of the hospital. After a long time, she slowly turned her eyes to look around. Hospital again. But it was an intensive care unit. She felt as if there were 2 fixed tubes delivering oxygen to her nose. She felt as if there was something clamped on her fingers. There were several medical instruments around her, and from time to time, beeping sounds could be heard. Jean-Wan opened her eyes and closed them again. After a moment, she opened them again. The nightmare-like experience on the highway lingered in her mind. She wanted to treat it all as a nightmare, but the faint pain in her stomach and the 4 drip on the back of her hand told her the cruelest truth. If the child was still there, the doctor would not have given her an injection. The ward was very quiet. Jean-Wan didn't move. She didn't have the strength to move. She silently digested all this, and her heart and abdomen seemed to ache at the same time. She had a dream just now. She dreamed that Mo Jingshan took her to the upper reaches of the Los Angeles River. She dreamed that Mo Nwan Studio was officially listed in High City and became a joint stock real estate company. She dreamed that she and Mo Jingshan appeared together at the Domestic Business Managers Conference. She dreamed that they stood side by side, and she was by his side, becoming the best version of herself. But when she opened her eyes, she found that she was surrounded by a cold and pale ward. There was no one around. This was a sterile ward. Only doctors in sterile clothes could enter. Jean-Wan lay quietly alone. Seeing the doctor come in and check her body by the bedside, he found that Jean-Wan had woken up. The doctor put his gloved hand on her forehead and said to her in English as if comforting her, "Miss G, although I know this may be cruel to you, we must apologize to tell you that the child was not saved. It was not easy for an adult to survive such a huge fall and impact. You have been unconscious here for 5 days and successfully passed the critical period. After 2 more days of observation, you can be transferred to a general ward. Jean Wan looked at the doctor silently and blinked gently, indicating that she had heard him. The doctor had seen many women who went crazy or emotional after suffering a major accident, but Jean Wan was very quiet and motionless. She slowly closed her eyes and was very calm. But she was so calm that it made his heart ache. The doctor always liked patients who were so cooperative. Seeing that she was too calm and quiet, he said to her patiently, "It was our best medical team who performed the surgery for you. Please rest assured that your fertility was not affected. After you recover, you can have another child. The 2-month-old child is just a small embryo. Don't be too sad. Your injury is really serious. Falling at that speed is equivalent to falling from at least 4 or 5 floors. You are lucky to be alive. You will continue to have everything in the future. Rest well and recover." Jean Wan closed her eyes silently and nodded slowly and weakly. 2 days later, as the doctor said, Jean Wan could be transferred from the ICU to a general ward. Jean Wan was still sleeping when she was transferred to the ward. When she woke up, she was already lying on the bed. Feng Ling pushed the door open and saw that Jean Wan was lying there motionless with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling of the ward. She walked in. "Madame Mo came just now, but you were still sleeping. She personally made chicken soup for you to nourish your body." With that, Feng Ling came over and opened a white thermos flask by the bed. The fragrance from it instantly wafted out. Jean Wan had been unconscious for 5 days and had been in the ICU with an oxygen tube for 2 days. She hadn't spoken for a week. When she smelled the fragrance, her chapped lips moved. She wanted to speak, but her voice was too hoarse. "Where is Mo Jingshan?" Jean Wan asked where Mo Jingshan was, not how he was now. If the answer was that he was still in the hospital, it meant that at least he was still alive. If the answer was, not in the hospital, Jean Wan didn't dare to think further. She turned to look at Feng Ling, who was helping her to ladle the chicken soup. "Answer me." Feng Ling ladled the chicken soup out and gently stirred it in the bowl with a spoon to make the soup less hot. While stirring, she said, "The body and the interior of the car were seriously deformed. Mr. Mo's driver's seat was too narrow. When his head was hit, a steel bar in the car pierced Mr. Mo's cervical vertebra and spine, and another one directly penetrated his shoulder." Jean Wan's hands on her sides instantly clenched, and her body was cold. Chapter 355. Feng Ling came over and shook the head of Jean Wan's bed, trying to feed her soup. Jean Wan didn't open her mouth but looked silently at the door. After a long silence, she asked, "His cervical spine and spinal nerves were injured. Will he wake up?" Feng Ling tightened her grip on the spoon. Although Jean Wan was not a medical student, she certainly knew the most basic human knowledge. The spine and cervical spine were both key parts of the brain. Even if Mr. Mo's vital organs were not injured, it was a miracle that he could survive such a serious car accident. But judging from the fact that he had been in a coma for 7 days and was still in danger, it was unknown whether he could wake up or not. The doctor had said that there was only a 30% chance that Mr. Mo could survive. If he couldn't hold on, the result of the treatment was likely to be a coma. But she couldn't tell Jean Wan this at all. But now, even if she didn't say it, Jean Wan could guess it. Feng Ling was silent for a moment, sat by the bed, and put the bowl to her mouth. "Mrs. Mo has been in the hospital these days. She made this soup and brought it to you. Drink some first." "Mrs. Mo?" Jean Wan looked at the chicken soup in the bowl. Sure enough, Ms. Wanzhu's cooking skills were really good. She could smell the soup just like a chef. She couldn't imagine how Wanzhu felt when she endured the pain of losing her son and the pain of her daughter-in-law's miscarriage and insisted on making soup for her. "Drink some. Mrs. Mo's pain and worry are no less than yours, but she is really strong. For Mr. Mo's sake, you have to hold on, especially you." Now you have to take good care of your body. And if you drink this soup, Mrs. Mo will feel better. Jean Wan obediently took a sip. It was indeed delicious. It was light but not tasteless. How long will it take for him to pass the critical period? After a few sips, Jean Wan couldn't drink any more and asked hoarsely. Knowing that she couldn't drink now, Feng Ling put the bowl aside and answered, I don't know. He still needs to be observed and treated. Dr. Qin has rushed here after receiving the news. Don't worry about the medical environment in the United States. As long as there is a glimmer of hope, they will use the best medicine and medical means to save Mr. Mo. Since Feng Ling had said so, even if Jean Wan's heart was falling apart, she could only keep calm on the surface. They didn't want her to be too sad. It was unnecessary for her to be sad now. The only thing she could do was not to let them worry about her. After another week, Mo Jingshan was still in a coma. There were even a few times when he was critically ill but was saved in an emergency. During this period, Jean Wan couldn't sleep well every night. As long as she closed her eyes, she would see the scene of the black Bentley rushing over in front of her. The loud crash and the soaring shock woke her up again, and then she couldn't sleep anymore. These days, the news she learned from Feng Ling was that Su Shui died in the car with the spontaneous combustion system. When the Los Angeles police came to investigate, they did presume that Su Shui had some grudges with Jean Wan, and because of her emotional instability, she wanted to die with Jean Wan, but in the end, she died in the exploding car. When the police went to the Su family to collect evidence, Elder Su and Su Jilan didn't say much. Only Su Jilan told the media that Su Shui was her closest cousin, and she didn't expect her to be so crazy that she would go to such extremes as dying with others. One by one, the responsibility was piled on Su Shui. Dead men tell no tales. Although this case was not closed hastily, the police had basically confirmed this situation, so they did not continue to search for the truth so seriously. Even if Jean Wan wanted to confront Su Jilan now, she couldn't go out of the hospital, and Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up. She didn't have the energy to identify or accuse Su Shui. After all, she didn't have any evidence. Su Jilan really made use of Su Shui. Everything was so natural that even the police with a keen sense of smell didn't notice anything wrong. But Jean Wan wouldn't let go of the murderer who caused her miscarriage. Time passed day by day. Jean Wan couldn't get up at first, but a few days later, she could walk around the ward, and half a month later, she could occasionally go to Mo Jingshan's ICU and stare blankly. There was no glass in this ward, so she couldn't see what was going on inside or the people inside. She could only feel the man a few meters away from her through the wall, but somehow she felt he was so far away. Every day, the first thing Jean Wan asked when she woke up, is Mo Jingshan awake? The answer she got was a shake of the head. Jean Wan couldn't imagine that he had been in a coma for nearly 20 days, but from the doctor's occasional conversations, she could tell that the worst result was that he would sleep forever. The winter nights in Los Angeles were really cold. Standing outside Mo Jingshan's ward, Jean Wan raised her hand and touched the cold wall. The light in the wall had been out for a long time, but she still refused to leave. She just wanted to stay here with him, waiting for him to wake up and open his eyes. After being separated by the wall for so many days, Jean Wan recalled her relationship with Mo Jingshan in her previous life. It was so simple for a person to disappear from life. Mo Jingshan disappeared so completely in those 10 years, just like now, silently and without a trace. Fate seemed to play a big joke on Jean Wan. She thought she had found back everything she had lost in her previous life, but now it seemed to be pulling away bit by bit. In her previous life, Mo Jingshan could return to China safely after 10 years. How could he stay in a coma now? 2 days later, Jean Wan squatted alone outside Mo Jingshan's ward in the middle of the night. She looked out of the window at the moonless night sky and waited for him to wake up longer and longer. When Jean Wan was well enough to be discharged from the hospital, it had been a month since the car accident. Mo Jingshan had been in a coma for a month. 3 days ago, the doctor said that he had passed the critical period and his life had stabilized, But when would he wake up? Maybe tomorrow, or maybe never. Jean Wan wanted to stay with him in the hospital, but Wanju forced her to go back to the Mo family in Los Angeles. With Jean Wan here, Wanju felt that Mo Jingshan was also here. Seeing Jean Wan, she felt at ease and didn't want Jean Wan to be in a daze every day and night in the cold hospital. Lying in the bedroom where Mo Jingshan used to sleep, Jean Wan called him 3 times a day even though she knew his cell phone wasn't answered. Every time, his cell phone was turned off. Jean Wan followed Wanju to the hospital again, but she still couldn't enter the ward at will. She hadn't seen him for a month. Jean Wan squatted in the corridor, holding her cell phone and texting Mo Jingshan. She only sent one sentence. Mo Jingshan, I'm scared. Dash. Chapter 356. The police had closed the case of Su Shui's death in the car. On the day the case was closed, the head of the police came to the hospital. Mo Shaoza took the photos taken at the crime scene and saw the photos of Mo Jingshan's smashed black Bentley. He negotiated with the police about these photos and asked the truck driver's confession. Jean Wan walked past them, heard what they said, saw the stack of photos in Mo Shaoza's hand, and saw the black smoke spreading from Su Shui's car after the fire was extinguished. She suddenly turned to look at Feng Ling, who had been following her. Come with me to the Su family. The Su family? Su Shui's home. Su Shui's parents were in charge of the Swan Group in Los Angeles, which was not to be underestimated. However, Su Shui's parents were obviously just honest businessmen and had never participated in the affairs of Elder Su and the Su family. When Jean Wan arrived at the Su family, Su Shui's parents almost rushed up to strangle her when they saw her, saying that she killed their daughter. Feng Ling stopped Su Shui's parents expressionlessly, and with Feng Ling's cooperation, Jean Wan entered the Su family unimpeded. B*TCH. Our Shui has been killed because of you. What are you doing here? Get out of here. We don't welcome you here. Jean Wan entered the door and heard the roar of Su Shui's parents. She stopped and looked back at them coldly. If you had been a little wary of the people closest to you, Su Shui wouldn't have ended up like this. She was killed because of me? Did she really die because of me? Su Shui's mother had been crying for a month and stared at her with swollen eyes and pale face. Su Shui's father, who was still rational, pointed at Jean Wan and scolded, Our Shui was tortured to madness because of you. She barely survived, but in the end, she died because of you. How dare you say she didn't die because of you? Jean Wan turned around and no longer looked at them, and the faint trace of mockery in her eyes did not fall into their eyes. She just said lightly, I almost died in the hands of your daughter twice. Maybe I am indeed more fortunate than her. At least I don't have a sister who seems to be close to me but actually wants to use me to harm me. Jean Wan suddenly paused. Why not? Wasn't her previous life ruined in the hands of her good sister, Ji Mengran? Therefore, the scariest thing in the world is never the enemy standing in the open, but the so-called closest person who plays with you every day and seems to be on the same side as you, but is always trying to push you into the abyss. What do you mean? What did Shui's death have to do with Jilan? We all know that Jilan and Shui grew up together. Don't think that just because Shui is dead, there's no evidence. Now you're still trying to point the finger at Jilan. You're still trying to sow discord at a time like this. Women are truly the most vicious. Father Su couldn't push Feng Ling away at all. After cursing for a long time, he could only be blocked by Feng Ling. Jean Wan was expressionless. Based on Su Shui's suicidal behavior, the police concluded that she was the mastermind of the whole thing and hastily closed the case. As her parents, are you really willing to let your daughter bear the crime of attempted murder and self-immolation? Jean Wan didn't look at them but spoke while observing everything in the Su family, her voice cold and indifferent. Father Su and Mother Su's expressions changed slightly and they stared at her. Where is the room where Su Shui used to live? Jean Wan asked directly. Father Su hesitated and looked at Jin Wan's back suspiciously. When he was about to speak, Mother Su grabbed his arm with a broken look and stopped him from speaking. You can't let her into our daughter's room. We can't let such a woman who killed Shui enter Shui's room. Jin Wan abruptly turned her head, only to see Su Jingshan's mother's red eyes. For a moment, she thought of how Mo Jingshan's mother had not shed a single tear in front of her these days despite her depression. Jin Wan paused and then said, Are you sure I killed Su Shui? Am I not one of the victims? Mother Su ignored her and looked away with red eyes. Father Su pointed to the second floor. Second floor, the room with the white door. Jin Wan withdrew her gaze and turned to walk in. The Su family was not small. She walked up the stairs and circled around on the second floor before she found Su Shui's room. The servants of the Su family were surprised to see her, but no one dared to stop her. They just stood aside and looked strangely at the person who suddenly broke in. Jin Wan walked into the bedroom that Su Shui used to live in. The room that was filled with the heart of a young girl had not changed even though its owner had passed away. It was as though someone had insisted on cleaning it every day for the past month. Even the KT cat pillow on the bed appeared as though it had just been washed and was neatly placed there. The room was filled with the smell of air freshener. Jin Wan looked around, walked to the table in the room, and saw a delicate photo frame, in which the photo was a group photo of Su Shui and Su Jilan. She picked up the photo frame, turned it over, and opened it. When the photo fell out, she saw the words on the back, 200x, taken in Japan. That was to say, Su Shui and Su Jilan had been to Japan a year ago, and Su Jilan was not locked up at home by Elder Su because of mania as people said. Relatively speaking, she was very free. On the table shelf were some simple items that were suitable for young girls. How could someone with the heart of a romantic young girl be so vicious and merciless as to run all the way to T-City to kidnap her? Jin Wan opened the drawer under the table and asked the servant at the door, Did Su Shui have any contact with anyone other than her cousin when she was alive? The servant didn't know who Jin Wan was and subconsciously answered, Before she went crazy, she had a good interpersonal relationship with her friends and classmates, but when she suddenly dropped out of school and said she was going to study in China, she only kept in touch with Miss Su Jilan. At this time, Jin Wan's hand paused in the drawer. She looked at the bottles of medicine in it, picked them up, opened them, put them to her nose, and sniffed them. Suddenly, her eyes were cold, and she covered the bottles again and held them in her palm. She continued to rummage through the other things in the drawer and asked, Did Su Jilan also send these medicines? Chapter 357. Really? Jin Wan held the bottle of medicine in her palm. If it were any other medicine, she might not have recognized it so quickly, but at this time, she didn't know whether it was fate or fate. She had taken this kind of medicine. It was the same medicine that Ji Mengran had taken to stimulate her emotions and cause her mental disorder. How could this be a medicine that could calm her down? This kind of medicine would only make Su Shui, who was already crazy, more emotionally unstable, and more unable to withstand any stimulation. What was mania? Everyone knew that Su Jilan had this kind of illness, but they didn't know that she had driven her cousin crazy. Jin Wan went to check Su Shui's wardrobe and the drawers and tables in several other rooms. She tried to just check and look through them and put them back neatly before closing the door. She had to respect the dead. Even if she didn't like Su Shui, she still had to behave herself. The result of the examination proved that Su Jilan did give Su Shui this kind of medicine that could cause mental disorder. The original cause of madness was neurasthenia. This kind of medicine would aggravate Su Shui's illness, and if the doctor didn't give Su Shui a blood test, he couldn't guess the cause or find out the cause. Jin Wan called K and asked him to go to the police station to get Su Shui's autopsy report. Even if Su Shui was blown to pieces, the autopsy report must have been done by the forensic doctor. In the afternoon, Jin Wan had stayed at the Su family for several hours, and Father Su and Mother Su had gradually calmed down and sat on the sofa opposite her. Trying to be as calm as possible, Jean Wan had a rough idea of what had happened after hearing some things from Father Su and Mother Su. I've asked you so many questions, but I haven't said a word about Su Zhilan. You can continue to think that I wanted to drag Su Zhilan down with me after Su Shui died, but if you calm down and think about it carefully, when Su Shui and I were kidnapped at the same time and woke up in that car, the driverless car was already on the highway. The worst result was that Su Shui and I died together. The dead can't testify. Who will benefit most if we both die? Father Su frowned and didn't speak. They were businessmen and naturally knew the cause and effect of many things. These days, they only focused on Jean Wan and Su Shui, but ignored Su Zhilan who had been caring for them. As for Su Shui's case, it was highly likely that Su Shui directed and acted on her own. The police investigated and collected evidence from various parties and found that it was indeed Su Shui who initiated it. When the police went to Elder Su and Su Zhilan to investigate, they obtained the most useful testimony, which determined the outcome of the case. But if he really led this matter to Su Zhilan's point of view, it didn't seem that simple. At this moment, Mother Su suddenly received a call. When she put down the phone, she looked at Jean Wan and then at her husband by her side. She said in a low voice, "It's Zhilan. She said she'll come to visit us in the afternoon and asked if we need to bring anything." Father Su's face was gloomy and he didn't say anything, but Jean Wan asked with a faint smile, "After Su Shui died, did Su Zhilan often come to see you?" "No, she just stayed by our side during the memorial service. Other times, she would usually call us every 2 or 3 days to comfort us. She said that she would be our daughter in the future and that if we needed anything, we should tell her." Mother Su was still sobbing a little. With red eyes, she said, "Today was the first time she said she would come to our house. Looks like Miss Su knows I'm here." Jean Wan smiled mildly as she glanced at them. "I won't see her. When she comes, tell her to look for me at the police station. I'll wait for her there." Su Qianxi's father suddenly frowned and said, "Although the things you asked just now do make sense when we think about them carefully, you can't wrongly accuse a good person. Zhilan has been very good to our family. If you hurt Zhilan just to clear your name or for your own interests, we won't allow it." Jean Wan said expressionlessly, "The case has been closed. I'm the victim from the beginning to the end, and the police didn't make things difficult for me. Why do I need to clear my name? Benefits? What are my benefits? My 2-month-old baby is gone. Do you think I have to sacrifice my husband's life and the baby's life just to make Su Zhilan a suspect?" Speaking of Mo Jingshan's current situation and Jean Wan's miscarriage, Father Su and Mother Su fell silent. Jean Wan was going to find out the real murderer behind the scenes and avenge her child and Mo Jingshan. Today, she came here to sort out her emotions and thoughts. Now that she suddenly mentioned these things, she felt very depressed. She stood up and walked out without looking back. Jean Wan went to the police station and handed over some of the evidence she had collected in the Su family to the police. At the same time, she gave a recording pen to the police. The content of the recording pen was from the moment she walked into the Su family to the moment she left. In the past few hours, the conversation with the servants, the conversation with Father Su and Mother Su, as well as some detailed details of the process. After all, Jean Wan was Mo Jingshan's wife. She suddenly demanded a reversal of the case and a new investigation, so the police did not dare to neglect her. Su Zhilan's biggest advantage was that no matter what happened, no one would suspect her, so she could avoid all the suspicions and get away successfully. But now, as long as all the suspicions were piled on her and the police kept investigating her, there would be results. Mo Jingshan hadn't woken up yet, so she couldn't get more favorable evidence from him. But now, as long as Su Zhilan's suspicion was cleared, she wouldn't be able to continue to get away with it. In the evening, Su Zhilan, who had been to the Su family, soon arrived at the police station. As soon as she entered the police station, she saw Jean Wan, who had just come out of the police evidence room, and Feng Ling standing at the door. Su Zhilan paused, then gave a faint smile and looked straight at Jean Wan, who had raised her eyes to meet hers. You're here? Jean Wan glanced at her flatly, without a smile or anger. Her eyes were as pale as a thick fog, but hidden in the fog was a killing intent that she had never had in her previous lives. Chapter 358. The real murderer hasn't been found, and the case is closed. How can I be reconciled to it? Jean Wan's words were indifferent and straightforward. Miss Su, I just casually said that I would come to the police station. If you want to see me, come to the police station to find me. I didn't expect you to come so soon. Didn't you go to the Su family to accompany Su Xue's parents? Seeing the coldness in Jean Wan's eyes and the hidden meaning in her words, Su Jilan looked at her incredulously and then smiled casually. Miss Ji, didn't you say that you would wait for me at the police station? Is it more important to see Su Xue's parents or to come to the police station to see me? Jean Wan was calm and collected. She did not even raise her eyelids. Her indifferent tone conveyed a clear coldness and disdain. I'm afraid you only went to the Su family to pay a visit before heading straight to the police station, right? Su Jilan slowly frowned and stared at Jean Wan. What on earth do you want to say, Miss Ji? Don't you know what I want to say? Otherwise, why would you come to the police station in such a hurry? Jean Wan's lips curved into a smile. I've already submitted the evidence to the police. I'll leave the rest to you, Miss Su. Su Jilan's smile gradually became unnatural. Why don't I understand what you mean? Didn't you ask me to come to the police station because Xue's case has been closed? Jean Wan was not in the mood to deal with her. Her eyes were cold, but her lips were slightly smiling. Miss Su, you're so good at acting. I used to think that you were too simple, too emotional, and too impulsive, but obviously, Su Xue was also deceived by your false appearance, so she wholeheartedly stood up for you. Su Jilan also smiled. I see why you asked me to come to the police station. Did you want to drag me down after Xue's death? I never expected that Miss Ji would be so cunning and ruthless. Xue's body is still warm. You should have stayed in the hospital to guard Jingshan. Why did you come out to torment our Su family? Jean Wan's delicate and mild eyes were filled with faint mockery. You'd better leave these words to the police. For example, how are you going to explain that the drugs you gave Su Xue to treat her are actually drugs that will make her mentally and emotionally unstable? The smile in Su Jilan's eyes gradually faded. She looked at Jean Wan and didn't speak, but her fingers suddenly tightened around the bag, betraying the shock in her heart. Are you surprised that I discovered something from this colorless and odorless medicine? Miss Su still has a lot to explain to the police. For example, before Su Xue went to Tea City, you frequently drank with her and complained to her, and then gave her a lot of small gifts. After she was instigated by you to go to Tea City, you closed the door to her when she came back. It wasn't until something happened to her and she became crazy that you began to play the role of a good cousin. You can also explain to the police that while Su Xue was crazy, you said that you were taking her out to relax, but in reality, you were taking her to the cinema to watch horror movies, to the amusement park, or to some haunted houses. You had no intention of improving her madness at all, and you didn't intend to comfort her. In addition, you can also explain to the police that Su Xue was resting at home with a cold that night, but you suddenly took the initiative to ask her to accompany you to the party. She didn't have anything like a fruit knife in her bag, but you asked her to bring a knife to protect herself because she was afraid of people. The dress she wore at that time was chosen by you at the last minute, wasn't it? She should wear size S, but she wore size M that day. It can be seen how anxious you were before you went to the party. You didn't even give her time to change into a dress of the right size. Also, do you think the purchase record of that modified new BMW can be erased like the record of the courier company? After all, BMW is not a company you can easily threaten and control. They still have a record of car purchase. For example, you said you would give Su Xue a new car, and the car was registered in Su Xue's name, but on the day you bought the car, you swiped the card of your family servant. A week later, you transferred money from your grandfather's card to fill the vacancy in the servant's card. Your grandfather's card has been in your hands for a long time. You went around in a big circle just to hide your car purchase record. Su Zhilan's face grew paler. She looked calm, but the flicker in her eyes revealed some of her emotions. Jin Wan's exquisite face coldly smiled. The recordings and evidence I've submitted aren't enough to drag you into this. But Miss Su, you're too suspicious. The police will investigate based on this evidence. Did you think that no one would suspect you? Su Zhilan pursed her lips. It's just your guess. I can understand that you don't want me to live a peaceful life, but I've been with Shui for so many years. You can't just provoke us. She won't, her soul in heaven should be awake. Once you say these lies, aren't you afraid she will come back to kill you in the middle of the night? Jin Wan was not in the mood to argue with her. I advise you not to waste your saliva on me. If you want to explain, go in and talk to the police yourself. Jin Wan said again, the Su family is indeed rich and powerful in Los Angeles, and they can use their wealth to hide some things in the police station to keep their innocence. But now the Mo family is involved, and Mo Jingshan has not woken up yet. If the Su family wants to cover up the truth, they have to ask the Mo family first. With that, Jin Wan walked straight past Su Zhilan. Su Zhilan suddenly stood in front of her. Jin Wan, you know Jingshan hasn't woken up yet, and you just had a miscarriage. Are you sure you have good intentions by causing a scuffle between the Su family and the Mo family at this time? The word miscarriage was really harsh to hear from Su Zhilan's mouth. Feng Ling reached out and pulled Jin Wan over. Su Zhilan glanced at Feng Ling and moved her lips, but in the end, she just lowered her voice. Jin Wan, we'd better not involve others in our affairs. My grandfather is old, and Jingshan's parents are worried sick because of Jingshan's coma. You don't have to vent your anger on all of us because of Shui's matter. Chapter 359. Su Zhilan's hand trembled and she tried to free her hand, but Jin Wan held it tightly. What are you doing? Let go of me. Su Zhilan struggled to break free from her hand. But Jin Wan still held her hand tightly. Her smile was cold, but her voice was so light that only Su Zhilan could hear it. How can I let go of you? I won't let go of you until the murderer who killed my child is brought to justice. Jin Wan, did you think that Su Shui's death meant that there was no evidence? Did you think that the police would close the case as soon as possible while Mo Jingshan was unconscious? Did you think that no one would suspect you? Did you think that you could continue to be a spotless young lady, continue to play the role of a manic, timid, and emotional patient? Did you think that you were invulnerable? Let go of me. Su Zhilan, let me tell you, I'm a calculative person. Every wound you cause me, I'll return it to you tenfold. Even if I dig out your heart, stomach, and uterus, I won't be able to get rid of the hatred in my heart for what you stole from me. Don't think the Mo family won't suspect you and no one will do anything to you even if Mo Jingshan doesn't wake up. Su Zhilan was still trying to free her hand, but Jin Wan was so strong that she held her wrist so hard that she almost broke her wrist. From beginning to end, Feng Ling didn't reach out to help restrain Su Zhilan, because she saw a woman who was extremely angry because she had lost her unborn child. Feng Ling had never seen Jin Wan like this. It wasn't until Jin Wan finally let go that Su Zhilan was able to break free. She took a step back and looked at Jin Wan's flat belly with lingering fear. It's just your suspicion. Su Zhilan calmed herself down and tried to stay away from Jin Wan. At this time, a policeman came out of the police station. When he saw Su Zhilan, he asked her to enter the interrogation room to record her statement. Su Zhilan hesitated for a moment before turning to look at Jin Wan. Jin Wan just looked at her indifferently and said nothing. When they walked out of the police station, it was snowing outside. Feng Ling wrapped the scarf around Jin Wan's neck and whispered as they walked to the car, Mrs. Mo, do you need me to inform the base about this? There's no need. Once the Mo family gets involved, the Su family won't be able to get away with it. Mo Shaozi is the chairman of the Shine Group, and he'll put pressure on the police in person once the suspicions about Su Jilan reach him. Alright, let Director Mo do it. After all, Mr. Mo hasn't woken up yet, and he has nowhere to vent his anger. When they returned to the hospital, Mo Jingshan was still unconscious. His ward was still not open to anyone. It was already dark, and Wan Zhu took Jin Wan back to the Mo family. At dinner, there was soup specially made for Jin Wan. Since Jin Wan's miscarriage, she had been drinking soup almost every day to nourish her body. Jin Wan always felt that Wan Zhu was trying to find traces of her son in this world in this way. Every day, Wan Zhu said nothing. The two words that everyone in this family was most afraid to hear now were sleep and vegetative state. This was the most frightening result. After dinner, Jin Wan returned to the bedroom, closed the door, and went into the bathroom. After taking a shower, she sat on the edge of the bed with the laptop that Mo Jingshan had used before. She opened the mailbox and saw the work emails from Moan Wan's studio in High City, but she was not in the mood to read them. She just sat on the bed, stared at the words on the screen, and raised her hand to touch the roses in the vase beside the bed. The flowers were put in by the servants in a fixed number of rooms every day. On the night of the spring festival, Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan lived here, and she saw the roses in the same position. What did she say at that time? On her birthday in Tea City, she didn't even touch the rose petals on the ground before she destroyed them, so now she felt sorry for the roses. She curled up on the edge of the bed, looked at the flowers, took out her cell phone, took a photo, and sent it to Mo Jingshan. The flowers in your room are so beautiful every day. I haven't seen you for a month. I don't even know if you are withered or in full bloom. Sometimes people might have such a persistence, especially for the people they loved. Whether the other party was alive or dead, even if he was just a pile of yellow bones, as long as she could see him, at least she would feel at ease. But in the whole month, the only 2 times she looked in when the doctor opened the door were the 2 times she saw Mo Jingshan lying on the white hospital bed, quiet and motionless, his body full of various instruments and colorful wires and tubes. He didn't open his eyes, not even his eyelashes moved. But in the blink of an eye, the door was closed, and she never saw him again. It had been a whole month. Jin Wan called Mo Jingshan 3 times a day as usual and sent him a text message before going to bed as usual. As time went by, she was also very confused. If he continued to sleep like this, did he not want her anymore? Why did he come into her life so forcefully and change her life, but then lie there quietly and motionless, making her so afraid? It was snowing heavily. After a few more snowfalls in Los Angeles in February, this winter would be over. Jin Wan was wrapped in a white cashmere coat, sitting on the stairs in front of the hospital. Her head was covered with white snow. Because she hadn't moved much, the snow hadn't melted, so there was a lot of snow on her head. From a distance, she looked like a snowman piled up on the stairs. When Qin Sighting walked out of the hospital and saw the scene, he put one hand in his trouser pocket and stared at it for a long time before he walked down to Jin Wan's side, patted the snow off her head, took off his coat, and put it on her. Jin Wan didn't need to turn her eyes. She just slightly tilted her head and saw it was Qin Sighting's leather shoes, so she didn't move. He has been sleeping. It's meaningless for you to come here every day, Qin Sighting said. I think you'd better go back to High City first. Your studio still needs you, and the Ji family and grandfather Mo also need you to go back and comfort them. Jin Wan silently looked at the car speeding by and said indifferently, Dr. Qin, didn't you also fly here from High City? Why haven't you gone back after staying here for so long? Your home and the focus of your work are in High City, but you have been here recently. Aren't you also waiting? Qin Sighting looked down at her. After a moment, he sighed with a smile and simply sat down on the same stairs as her, looking in the same direction as Jin Wan. After a long time, he said, even I don't know when he will wake up. If he doesn't wake up for a year, are you going to wait here for a year? If he doesn't wake up for 10 years, are you going to wait for 10 years? Jin Wan didn't speak, just holding her cell phone and scrolling through the messages she had sent to Mo Jingshan. Chapter 360. Jean Wan received a call from the police station. The driver of the giant truck died in prison in the early hours of this morning. Hearing this, Jean Wan put on her clothes and quickly went out of the door. When she rushed to the police station, the police showed her the surveillance footage of the prison and gave her the driver's death certificate and the forensic examination results. The forensic examiner found some chronic poison in the driver's body. When the driver died, he vomited black blood, and his internal organs had been destroyed unknowingly. None of his internal organs were intact. There was nothing he could do to save him. Watching the video replay of the driver suddenly vomiting blood and falling to the ground, and then looking at the forensic examination results, Jean Wan felt cold hands and feet. Prison, chronic poison, vomiting blood. This was exactly the same way she died in her previous life. She used to think that because everyone in her previous life believed that she killed the daughter of the Yun family, the family of the deceased conspired with the prison to kill her, or Ji Mengran, who was far away in the United States, had some contact with the people in the prison. At that time, she didn't know the existence of An Shuyan or Su Jilan, but it didn't mean that they didn't know her existence. So who killed her in her previous life? This was exactly the same way he died. The replay pierced Jean Wan's eyes like a thorn. She could even feel the terrible pain all over the driver's body when he suddenly vomited blood and fell to the ground in prison. That suffocating feeling made her feel despair. Has Su Jilan returned to the Su family? Jean Wan paused the replay and looked up at the police station. Yes, Miss Su has been taken back by her grandfather, but as a suspect, her freedom will be temporarily controlled by us, and she can't leave Los Angeles easily. Jean Wan clenched the forensic examination results in her hand, looked at the scientific name of the drug on it, and kept it in mind. After leaving the police station, Jean Wan used her cell phone in the car to check the ingredients and symptoms of this poison. When Fong Ling drove, she saw that Jean Wan had been sitting quietly looking at her cell phone, motionless as if there was no difference from a few days ago, but there seemed to be something in her eyes. Very cold, very cold. Jean Wan searched for the explanation of mania. The typical symptoms were an elevated state of mind, an increase in thinking and inner activities, overconfidence, and even exaggerated imagination and behavior. Most of the time, they would be agitated and uneasy, and they would not consider the consequences when carrying out any purpose. It was a disease that could not be seen when one was calm, but once the spirit was stimulated, or when one insisted on doing something, one would be overly dark and agitated, unlike ordinary people. Therefore, Su Jilan's mania was different from Su Shui's madness. Su Shui was really crazy and irrational, while Su Jilan had confidence and darkness buried under the surface of calmness and rationality. She had all kinds of tricks up her sleeves. Back at the hospital, Qin Sighting had just come out of Mo Jingshan's ward when Jean Wan was already waiting in the corridor. Dr. Qin, is this kind of drug common on the market? Jean Wan handed him the results of the forensic examination. Qin Sighting glanced at her, took the things she handed him, looked at them, and then looked at her. This kind of chronic poison is not common in our country and can even be said to be rare, but it can be bought in some places in the United States. However, if you want to buy it, you have to go through certain channels, either with someone behind the scenes or with enough money. This kind of poison can stay in the body for 2 or 3 months without any symptoms. The drug is stable during the incubation period, but it is not certain that one day the poison will take effect, and there is no cure. How does this poison enter a person's body? 2 ways, intravenous injection or ingestion through food. If it's injected, it will enter the blood vessels directly and die faster. If it's poisoned only by eating, it will die slower. The process can be long or short. I don't know much about this kind of drug, so I just know a general idea. With that, Qin Sighting looked at Jean Wan coldly. Haven't the police found a remittance of 5 million yuan in his account? This is obviously the way he chose to die, and his wife and children have been settled. He was injected with this poison before the incident. Fong Ling, Jean Wan turned her eyes to Fong Ling behind her. Dr. Qin said that if you want to buy this kind of drug, you have to go through certain channels, which I guess only you can find out. Help me check if Su Jilan or anyone close to the Su family has recently bought this kind of drug. Okay. Fong Ling nodded. I'll send someone to check it right away. In the evening, she returned to the Mo family's home. Before she entered the door, she heard Wan Zhu and Mo Shaozi quarreling. Jingshan hasn't woken up yet. This morning, you gave the only place to visit him to in Shuyan. You can go in yourself, or I can go in. When Jin Wan returns to the hospital, it's understandable for Jin Wan to go in to accompany Jingshan. But why did you let in Shuyan in? Jin Wan just had a miscarriage. Are you trying to take advantage of Jingshan's unconsciousness to drive away the wife he has always held in the palm of his hand? You weren't here in the morning, and I couldn't get to the hospital in time. Jin Wan went to the police station, and Xu Yan happened to go to the hospital at that time. It's reasonable for me to let her in. Besides, Jingshan is still asleep. How can he know who went in? How can he not know? Jin Wan hasn't seen him for more than a month. If she goes in to accompany Jingshan, Jingshan may be able to hear her, and Jin Wan may be able to wake him up. But you actually gave such a good opportunity to Xu Yan. Mo Shaozi, oh Mo Shaozi, people around you say you are an old stubborn man, and I have been protecting you. Now I find that you are really an old stubborn man. If Jin Wan finds out about this, how sad she will be. Go away. I don't want to talk to you now. You old stubborn man. Jin Wan stood outside the door of the Mo family's villa for a while and suddenly found that after more than a month of waiting and suffering, her heart had been dulled. She was no longer so easily angry or sensitive. However, because Mo Jingshan's condition had stabilized, she was finally allowed to go in to visit him alone. However, Mo Shaozi didn't call her back to the hospital but let in Xu Yan in. He really disregarded her too much. When the villa was quiet, Jin Wan pushed the door open and walked in. Wan Zhu looked back at her, got up, and walked up to her. Wan, why are you back so late? Chapter 361. The implication was that she had heard their conversation just now. Wan Zhu immediately glared at Mo Shaozi with a reproachful look. Mo Shaozi was about to sneer at her for not giving him face, but Wan Zhu glared at him. He swallowed his words, slammed the lid of the teacup in his hand, and said coldly, "As you wish." Marrying such an unreasonable husband was really infuriating. Wan Zhu hurriedly took Jin Wan's hand. Wan, Jingshan's condition is getting more and more stable. We'll stay in the hospital these days. As long as we can enter the ward, we'll let you in first. I know you miss him very much and want to stay with him for a while. I know. Don't be sad, child. Then Wan Zhu took Jin Wan back to the room, sat on the bed, and held her hand, saying, "In fact, Jingshan's father doesn't have much opinion of you. He just likes Xu Yan so much that it can only be attributed to preconceived notions." The marriage contract between Jingshan and the Su family was just a stopgap measure. At that time, Xu Yan was studying in the UK, not in the US, so Su Jilan's affair happened. In other words, in his heart, Xu Yan was raised according to the standard of the Mo family's daughter-in-law. He has always been on good terms with the Yin family, and he also watched Xu Yan being born and growing up, so their relationship is not the same. But Jingshan, after all, has his own ideas. He spent more time in High City, and in the years he was in America, he rarely got close to his family. He rarely interacted with the Yin family, and he only met Xu Yan a few times. You know what happened after that, and you know Jingshan's attitude, so don't let the stubborn ideas of Jingshan's father affect your mood. No matter what he does, he won't be so stupid as to force his son to divorce. He just doesn't want to give up and always wants to see if he can bring them together, but as long as you and Jingshan are as good as ever, he will give up after a long time. Jin Wan smiled. Perhaps it was because she grew up with her mother too little. Growing up with Ji Hongwen, she never knew what it felt like to have a good mother. But at this moment, she understood. Mo Jingshan, a cold and unreasonable man, occasionally showed a warm and amiable side. He must have inherited Wan Zhu's good temper. But to avoid such a situation happening again, Jin Wan moved back to the hospital. While Mo Jingshan was in a deep sleep, Jin Wan had not been idle. She was thinking of ways to avenge her child, to avenge Mo Jingshan, and to avenge herself. Good news came from Mo Nwan's studio in High City every day. Hearing that her studio had made more than 200 million yuan in profits in the past few months, Jin Wan just calmly held a video conference with everyone in the studio and continued to stay in Los Angeles. Grandfather Mo didn't know how Mo Jingshan and Jin Wan were, but they had been missing for a long time and hadn't returned to High City. He hadn't even heard Mo Jingshan's voice for a long time. After learning that they were in Los Angeles, he wanted to fly to Los Angeles several times to see them, but Jin Wan persuaded him not to. It was only when Ji Hongwen suddenly fell ill and was sent to the hospital that night that Jin Wan's vision darkened. Her heart turned cold. Jin Wan, who had been determined to stay in Los Angeles and stay with Mo Jingshan, finally wavered a little. In her previous life, she couldn't accompany Ji Hongwen in his last days. Even if Ji Hongwen's illness was caused by overwork and was not fatal, there was always a chance. Jin Wan couldn't gamble. Up to now, Ji Mengran was still missing and there was no news. Shen Haru was no longer at the Ji family. Ji Hongwen was the only one at home. If the servant hadn't found him early and sent him to the hospital in time, it was hard to say what would have happened. It turned out that every stage of a person's life was full of too many unknowns. Many things had to be changed, but they also had to pay the price. On the phone, the servant of the Ji family said, "Chairman Ji is now in the hospital. His life is not in danger, but he needs to be observed and may be hospitalized for a long time." "Are you going back?" Qin Sighting asked her. Jin Wan didn't know. She had been in the hospital for so many days, but still couldn't find a chance to enter the ward. When she finally got the chance to visit Mo Jingshan, Wan Zhu and Mo Shaozi were there. They were Mo Jingshan's parents, so she didn't compete with them for this chance. Even though Wan Zhu wanted her to accompany Mo Jingshan, Jin Wan insisted. After that, it was hard to get a chance. The sterile ward was rarely open. If it weren't for Mo Jingshan's physical fitness, he wouldn't have been able to get 2 chances to enter the ward. Jin Wan received a call from the Ji family again. The servant said that Ji Hongwen had lost a lot of weight recently and hadn't been able to eat for 2 days. He vomited as much as he ate. Although the doctor said his life was not in danger, he couldn't go on like this. They were worried that Chairman Ji wouldn't be able to hold on. When Mo Jingshan slept for nearly 2 months, Jin Wan finally nodded, silently packed up her things, and prepared to fly back to High City. Before she left, she didn't send him any text messages. She didn't know when he would see the messages she had sent in the past dozens of days. Feng Ling accompanied her to the airport. In the airport hall, people came and went. Jin Wan still remembered that when she secretly flew out of High City to Cambodia with Feng Ling, her heart had been anxious. Now, standing here, she was about to fly back to High City. She was no longer in a state of panic. But like duckweed without gravity, she floated all over the sky, unable to find an end or a home. At least at that time, she knew that Mo Jingshan was in Cambodia. She wanted to go to Cambodia to find him, and she did succeed. But where on earth was he now? After sleeping for so long, she didn't know whether she was in his dreams or where he had been in his dreams, and she couldn't find him. Feng Ling went to buy water for her, and Jin Wan went to line up for the boarding pass. She only took the simplest small silver suitcase. She didn't plan to stay long in High City and planned to fly back to Los Angeles when Ji Hongwen was better, so she didn't take much with her. When they were about to go through the international security check, Feng Ling hurriedly came back with the mineral water she had just bought. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. Feng Ling picked up the phone. When she heard what the other party said, her eyes changed, and she turned to look at Jin Wan with joy in her eyes. Holding the boarding pass and passport in her hand, Jin-won turned to look at her. What's wrong? Chapter 362. When Mo Jingshan woke up, he had been sleeping in the hospital for 2 months. As usual, Qin Sighting wore a white coat and a mask to enter the ward. As soon as he entered, he saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were open. He couldn't help raising his eyebrows and asking incredulously, "You're awake? Are my eyes playing tricks on me?" On the white bedsheet, the man looked calm and cold. His emotionless eyes looked at the man in the white coat beside the bed. After a while, he frowned. "How long have I slept?" His voice was very hoarse. "How long?" Qin Sighting resisted the urge to call Jin-won immediately and stared at Mo Jingshan, who was still in a daze. 2 months. Is it long? The man on the bed frowned and didn't speak for a while, as if he was thinking about something hard to figure out. It was not convenient to use a cell phone in this ward. Qin Sighting's hand paused in his pocket. He saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were cold and strange. Although he usually looked like this when he was cold, there seemed to be something more and something missing in his eyes. "It's really lucky that you survived the car accident." Jin-won didn't wait in vain to wake up. Qin Sighting smiled and sighed. When Mo Jingshan heard Jin-won's name, he suddenly raised his head and narrowed his dark eyes. "Jin-won? I say, you." Qin Sighting's brows twitched fiercely. At that time, the steel bars in the car directly injured your neck and spine. These are all connected to the nerves in your brain. Did you King lose your memory? Mo Jingshan didn't speak again. He raised his hand and pressed his slender index finger against his temple, as if he was still not very awake. "Holy shit, don't tell me you really lost your memory. Jin-won will cry to death." Qin Sighting was about to come forward to examine him. Before he touched him, the man on the bed frowned coldly and said coldly, "No, I remember." There was a strong sense of alienation in his voice, which was not directed at Qin Sighting but at the name Jin-won. Qin Sighting felt it was a little strange. Mo Jingshan had just woken up, and no one had offended him. This cold and distant aura of an absolute superior was too frightening. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "How do you feel right now?" Mo Jingshan nodded. "I'm fine. Just a headache." Mo Jingshan's voice was low and hoarse. His eyes were closed and he was not used to the light in the ward. Qin Sighting turned around and drew the curtains. When he turned back, he saw that Mo Jingshan had opened his eyes. The room suddenly dimmed and darkened, covering his deep eyes. Qin Sighting turned on the light wall lamp in the ward, took out his cell phone to check the time, and said, "I'll go out to inform your attending doctor, uncle, and aunt, and then call Jin-won. She's probably at the airport now. She hasn't woken up for 2 months. She's finally ready to go back to High City to see her father, but you woke up just in time. I hope she hasn't boarded the plane yet." Mo Jingshan looked at the phone that Qin Sighting took out without batting an eyelid. Looking at the model of the phone, he was silent for a long time and did not speak. An hour later, the medical staff came and went in the ward. Mo Shaoza and Wanju, who got the news, rushed to the hospital, but they didn't even see Mo Jingshan before the door of the ward was closed. Mo Jingshan didn't see anyone. The light in the room was dim, and the man on the hospital bed had a sore throat. After Qin Sighting walked out, he closed the door and quietly lay back on the bed. What entered his eyes was the white ceiling. In the empty, luxurious ward, the sound of the air conditioner was so weak that it could not be heard. He closed his eyes. After sleeping for 2 months, he had a very long dream. Who he was, he remembered. Who Jin-won was, he remembered. He remembered how the car accident happened. He remembered the scene when Jin-won rolled down from the car in front of him. When the huge impact happened, the steel bar in the car pierced his shoulder. He also remembered that he heard Jin-won's cries in the car and heard Feng Ling say worriedly that her lower body was bleeding. He remembered, the phone was quietly placed by the bed. He didn't know if anyone had charged it for him in the past 2 months. Mo Jingshan opened his eyes. After 2 months of sleep and recuperation, the wounds that should be healed had already healed. These movements of getting up and raising his hand were no longer affected. He picked up the phone on the white table beside the bed. The time shown on the phone was March 13th, 200x. His gaze paused for a moment and his head began to hurt again. There were dozens of missed calls and text messages on the phone. He opened them and found that most of them were from Jin Wan. Mo Jingshan, I'm scared. When will you wake up? I couldn't save our baby. You're angry, aren't you? I dreamed you woke up. Love you. Mo Jingshan, I love you. I love you very much. So don't keep sleeping like this. Wake up. If I knew that you would use such a method to save my life, I would rather die with Su Shui in that car than have you die for me. It's so cold today, but I can't stay in your ward. Is your bed warm? Can I sleep with you? I haven't seen you for half a month. I miss you so much. The doctor said you're likely to keep sleeping like this. Do you not want me anymore? Mo Jingshan, I miss you. Still won't wake up? I'm scared. I'm scared every day. The man on the bed quietly read the text messages. Until he finished reading dozens of them, he remained expressionless. His black, cold eyes carefully read them one by one and then he clicked the option to delete them all. Then Mo Jingshan rubbed his still aching brows and found the phone number of the person in charge of the Mo Corporation Legal Center in High City in his contact list. After the call was connected, the other party said in surprise, CEO Mo? Prepare 2 divorce agreements before the end of the month. Divorce agreements? Who wants a divorce? Me and Jin Wan. This marriage started in the Civil Affairs Bureau of High City, and according to the law, it had to end in High City. Qin Sighting had just pushed open the door of the ward with the medicine when he suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's words. He almost dropped the medicine bottle in his hand and looked at the cold, pale man as if he had seen a ghost. Mo Jingshan's expression didn't change at all when Qin Sighting came in. He hung up the phone, threw it aside, and closed his eyes. You want to divorce Jin Wan? Qin Sighting frowned. He knew Mo Jingshan too well. Although many people couldn't see through Mo Jingshan, Nanhang and Qin Sighting had been with him for so many years, and they always understood what he did more than they were curious about him. Mo Jingshan never did things that were too impulsive or unreasonable. He was too calm and rational. Not to mention how impeccable he was in the business world, he was absolutely considerate in marriage and love, and would never allow any misunderstanding or flaw to occur. Chapter 363. Mo Jingshan didn't answer him. Qin Sighting put down the medicine and stared at his indifferent and calm face. What the hell is going on? Who gave you a magic potion? You even forgot the woman you've been holding in your heart? Or did you suddenly realize how good it was to be single in the past 2 months, so you abandoned your woman for no reason? The man on the bed didn't speak. He was so cold and expressionless that he seemed to be isolated from the world. Qin Sighting was so angry that he wanted to curse. Do you know how long Jin Wan has been waiting outside the ward every day for the past 2 months? She, a woman who just had a miscarriage, knew she couldn't see you through the wall and the door, but she still insisted on waiting here every day. You almost died in the car accident, and so did she. You two have been through so much together, and it's not the first time you've been through life and death together. Now you suddenly say you want a divorce? Are you King stupid? Mo Jingshan closed his eyes and said flatly, get out. Qin Sighting was about to speak, when he suddenly heard footsteps coming from outside the ward and heard Feng Ling calling Jin Wan to slow down. He paused and looked at the man on the bed whose eyes were closed and whose face was cold. Jin Wan is coming. I'll stop her first. You'd better wake up as soon as possible. With that, he turned around and walked out. Jin Wan hurried to the hospital and saw that Imo Shaoza, Wan Zhu, and the others were all waiting at the door. Qin Sighting came out of the ward, glanced at everyone's face, and finally fixed his eyes on Jean Wan. Jean Wan rushed back from the airport. Los Angeles Airport was very far away, and it only took them 1.5 hours to get back. When Jean Wan ran in from the hospital, even Feng Ling, who was behind her, almost couldn't catch up with her. The breathless woman stared at Qin Sighting and then at the door of the ward behind him, asking, "Is he awake? Is he really awake?" Qin Sighting glanced at her calmly and felt a headache coming on. He raised his hand and pinched between his eyebrows. "Yes, he's awake, but he's been sleeping for too long. It's not suitable for him to see too many people now. Let him calm down first." Jean Wan immediately smiled. "It's all right. It's good that he's awake, it's good that he's awake." It didn't matter if she couldn't see him. She had already waited for 2 months. It didn't matter if she waited a little longer. As long as he woke up, it would be fine. He was not in a coma and did not become a vegetable. The doctor had said that as long as he could wake up, there would be no more problems. She was afraid that he would not wake up. As long as he woke up, everything would be fine. Her imagination did not leave. He had returned. Seeing the overjoyed expression on the woman's face, Qin Sighting's tone turned bitter, and he could not speak for a while. After a while, he comforted Wan Zhu and Mo Shaoza, telling them to go back and rest and wait for his call. Jean Wan still insisted on staying in the hospital, and Qin Sighting didn't force her to leave. When he saw Jean Wan put her suitcase against the wall, sat alone on the bench outside the ward, and waited as patiently as ever, he looked at her in silence for a long time. After a moment, he asked, "You're not going back to High City? Let's see how it goes." "I called High City on the way back to the hospital from the airport. The servant said that my father can eat something today, and his condition is better than 2 days ago." Qin Sighting nodded. After waiting for a whole night, Jean Wan did not enter the ward. Every time Qin Sighting came out and saw her, he persuaded her to go back to rest or sleep in the nurse's lounge. But since Jean Wan knew that Mo Jingshan had woken up, she couldn't fall asleep. At least let her see him. If she couldn't see him tonight, she could wait until tomorrow. She could wait. In the early morning, when it was almost dawn, Qin Sighting opened the door and took a look. Suddenly, he turned back to the ward with an ugly face and looked at Mo Jingshan, who had not slept since he woke up. "It's cold in the corridor. She has been sitting there motionless like a good baby all afternoon and all night. I can't stand it anymore. Take care of your woman. I'll go to the nurse's lounge to sleep for a while." Qin Sighting said and turned to leave. When he closed the door, he made a big noise. Jean Wan turned her eyes and looked at Qin Sighting's back strangely, wondering why he was so angry. She turned back to see that the door of the ward was not completely closed. Because he closed it too hard, it bounced back, leaving a small gap. The door was not locked, the other medical staff were not here, and Dr. Qin had left. There was a gap in the door, and Mo Jingshan had woken up. Everything seemed to tell her that she could go in. Even if he was temporarily asleep, she could go in to see him now. But Qin Sighting said during the day that he needed quiet now. Jean Wan licked her dry lips, stared at the small gap in the door for a long time, hesitated for a long time, but did not get up and go in. She continued to sit on the bench outside the door. Before Mo Jingshan agreed to let other medical staff in, she would respect his choice and wait patiently. The ward was very quiet. Mo Jingshan silently looked at the gap in front of the door. The lights in the ward were very dim, but the lights in the corridor were very bright. He could see the figure on the bench through the small gap. As Qin Sighting had said, she sat there like an obedient baby and did not make any noise or movement. It was as though she was afraid of disturbing him, or afraid of being driven away by the medical staff and not allowing her to continue staying here. It was gradually 6:30 in the morning, and she was still sitting there motionless. Mo Jingshan was silent for a moment, lifted the quilt, and got out of bed. Looking at the figure outside the door, he slowly walked to the door, and put his hand on it. At this time, the hospital was very quiet. Jean Wan was still not sleepy. Even though Mo Jingshan's footsteps were very light, she still heard them. She turned her eyes abruptly, and the moment the door was opened, she met the man's dark, cold eyes. Jean Wan stood up abruptly, but because she had been sitting all night, her legs were numb. She staggered and almost lost her balance. She raised her hands to support herself on the bench to prevent herself from falling down awkwardly. She then looked up at the man in the door. "Why did you get out of bed? You just woke up. Did the doctor say you can walk around now?" Jean Wan hammered her numb legs, straightened up, and walked up to him. When she reached the door of the ward, the homesickness was gone. She saw that Mo Jingshan was only a little thinner than before the accident, but there was no change. He was still him, the man she was familiar with. Chapter 364. With that, she leaned against the wall with a joyful expression, meeting the man's cold and emotionless eyes at such a close distance. The smile on her face gradually faded with his alienation and indifference. Finally, as if reading something in his deep eyes, her lips trembled. Why are you looking at me like this?" Mo Jingshan looked at her heavily. "How should I look at you?" At the very least, he shouldn't look at her so coldly, as if she was a stranger, unrelated to him, or even emotionless. Jean Wan paused and suddenly turned to look at the door. Then she turned back to look at him. "If it's because you just woke up and your body is not used to it, I'll go out now. You rest quietly. I'll stay with you outside. I won't leave or come in to disturb you, Miss G." The man's warm and cold voice came into her ears, but it seemed that after 10 years, the man who drew parallel lines with her life was pulled back in front of her eyes. In the large ward, the light poured on the floor, and the transparent dust floated up and down in the air, but the ward was silent. Only Mo Jingshan's bone-chilling voice resounded. Jean Wan's eyes suddenly froze. "Miss G?" Mo Jingshan looked at her coldly. "Don't be so surprised. Whether it was 10 years ago or 10 years ago, everything should return to its original point, and it should find the original track." The ward was frighteningly quiet. Such Mo Jingshan, such a him, for some reason, she had a feeling that she had never found him. He was as far away from her as he was 10 years later, untouchable, unseen, and unfathomable. Coupled with his words, she felt as if she had been splashed with a bucket of cold water. Her whole body was cold, and she almost lost her balance against the wall. All the joy she felt because he had finally woken up cooled in an instant. She stared at his eyes, but could not find any of the warmth and concern she had in the past. The deep love and sweetness were all gone. He was Mo Jingshan, but not the Mo Jingshan she was familiar with. He was different. Her lips moved. I'm still me. I haven't forgotten anything." The man's voice was indifferent but cruel. "It's just that I slept for too long and had a long dream." Jean Wan understood almost instantly, and the blood in her body almost froze at this moment. He knew. He knew everything. What she was most afraid of was that Mo Jingshan would know that she had been reborn. What she was most afraid of was that he would know that she had followed him closely from the beginning to change the course of her life. She just wanted to live a better life, but now the nightmare had come. Because she had stuck to this marriage with a purpose from the beginning, even though the result had changed and was far from what she had thought at the beginning. However, in the face of such a man who could instantly analyze what she had done when she had just been reborn, she was like a traveler who had hidden too many stolen goods in her backpack. He saw through her at a glance, and she was naked and unreservedly torn apart by him. Without thinking, Jean Wan suddenly raised her hand to clench the man's clothes, struggling to approach him, but Mo Jingshan didn't give her a chance to approach. He quietly avoided her hand and ignored her pale face. His deep and cold eyes only looked at the door of the ward, meaning that she could go. Jean Wan's face was almost transparent. She had never been so pale even when she was lying in the operating room during the abortion. Her voice was empty. Jingshan, his cold words hit her. After returning to High City, I'll sign the divorce agreement to you as soon as possible. Jin Wan looked up at him and asked blankly, divorce? A strange smile appeared on Imo Jingshan's cold and indifferent face. It seemed to be a mocking smile, but there was no warmth in it. I've used what I can, and it's time to end it. I'm just doing as you wish. The tall and straight man looks down at her. There is only indifference and gloominess in his eyes. The curve of his thin lips no longer has any warmth in the past. It is like an ice needle piercing people's pain. Doing as she wished? If she had been clear-headed enough, she wouldn't have led her life to such a state. To her, he was the best Imo Jingshan in the world. She would never willingly give him up. She could say that she did it to live a better life in this life, or she had ulterior motives. But right now, she truly loved him. She couldn't leave him. She truly wanted to live happily with him for the rest of her life. She truly wanted to live happily with him for the rest of her life. She didn't want to leave him. Divorce? How could she? She didn't intend to divorce him again in this life. Jin Wan opened her mouth and wanted to say something, only to find that sometimes words were really pale and powerless. When they met his eyes again, she raised her hand and raised the skin on the back of her hand and wrist, which were still slightly red from the burn she had suffered in Cambodia, to his eyes. Mo Jingshan, can we pretend that everything we've experienced between us doesn't exist? The man looked at her hands silently and didn't speak. Can we pretend that all the feelings between us don't exist? Jin Wan stared at him. Can all the promises we've made and vows we've held for so long be returned to zero because of your big dream? Jin Wan's face was full of tears, and she raised her hand to grab his collar. Mo Jingshan, I exchanged my life for my present life, my home, my husband, I exchanged my heart for it. What right do you have to deny everything about me now? Mo Jingshan bent down slightly because of the strength of her grip and didn't break free. Looking at her tearful face, he gradually sneered. This was the first time that he didn't have any intention of coaxing or hugging her when he saw her cry. He just watched her cry, and there was no other emotion in his eyes except coldness and sarcasm. He pinched her chin and narrowed his eyes. Life is really biased towards you. His voice paused for a moment and he stared into her eyes. Do you love me very much now? Jin Wan froze and then nodded firmly. Mo Jingshan seemed to have heard the funniest joke in the world, and his hand pinched her chin harder. Jin Wan, I've seen too many people who know how to adapt to circumstances, but I've never seen someone as sensible as you. You know exactly what you want, and you spare no effort to fight for it. Isn't it all because you don't want to become that poor soul in prison who died with blood? Jin Wan's tears welled up. She wanted to say no, but the man's eyes were too cold, and his fingers on her chin were too hard. Chapter 365. Jin Wan stared at him blankly. She couldn't believe that such heartless words would come from Mo Jingshan's mouth. What kind of mood did she have when she went to bed with him that night? She just didn't want to divorce again. She just wanted to cherish everything in front of her. She didn't want to take advantage of anyone. But in the ears of Mo Jingshan, who had the memory of 10 years later, these words were just another joke. When Jin Wan's jaw almost couldn't bear the pain, Mo Jingshan suddenly loosened his fingers. His pale and cold face seemed gentle, but the temperature between his eyes was so cold that it made her shudder. Don't cry. Your tears mean nothing to me. Jingshan. Looking at his eyes, Jin Wan felt as if a big hole had been dug in her heart, and her hands unconsciously tightened the corner of his clothes again. Mo Jingshan glanced at her fingers and sneered softly. You are still used to acting like a spoiled child in front of me. I didn't take advantage of you. I just don't want to make the same mistake again. I just try hard to cherish you and, cherish what? Mo Jingshan's hands hung by his sides as if he didn't even want to touch her again. His eyes were cold. Cherish the comfort that belongs to Mrs. Mo and don't have to live a homeless life for another 10 years? His thin lips were indifferent and cold to the bone. You have everything you want now, your studio is thriving, and the future is promising, and I just return everything between you and me to the original point, return your freedom, and let myself go. With that, he looked at her tears, took a step back, and took the corner of his clothes out of her hands. He took a few steps back until he kept a suitable distance from her. He looked coldly at the woman who was standing against the wall with a face even paler than his. He said with a cold smile, "Are you afraid of losing everything again?" Jean Wan looked at him, and her tears suddenly froze in her eyes and couldn't fall anymore. She closed her eyes. "Can we have a good talk?" "Forget it, Jean Wan." Mo Jingshan's thin lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth at all. He appeared colder than ever. "Everything between us has long ended. The marriage and feelings you thought you could salvage are just flowers in a mirror and the moon in the water. Right now, I have no interest in you at all. I don't even feel the need to take another look at you. You clearly remember everything. Mo Jingshan, why must you abandon all the good memories? Why must you push me away? You can even give up your life, but now you don't want me, right?" The man glanced at her indifferently, staring at her tears that were rolling down her face. Jean Wan had never cried in front of him like this, nor had she cried so sadly. His hands were by his side, and he did not raise them to wipe her tears. When Jean Wan took a step forward, he coldly stepped back, not giving her a chance to touch him. "All right, Jean Wan, this 10-month joke can come to an end. You know how far apart we are from each other, but you still pretend to be affectionate. It's too boring." Step by step, she finally came here and watched him sacrifice his life to save her. No matter how hurtful his words were, Jean Wan still tried to keep calm and chose to believe that he would not abandon her so easily. She sobbed, raised her hand, and wiped her tears with her sleeve. "Jingshan, does your body still hurt? Your head and you." Jean Wan's hand, which had just reached out to his arm, was instantly waved away by him. Jean Wan stubbornly stepped forward to hold him, but her hand was still pushed away by him, and he even ruthlessly threw her back to the door. "You don't want to leave? I'll give you the ward. I'm leaving." Mo Jingshan walked to the door without looking back. When he held the doorknob and was about to open it, he paused because of a sudden impact on his back. He looked sideways at the woman who suddenly rushed over and hugged him tightly from behind. His expression was indifferent, and his thin lips were drawn into a long and distant curve. "Your slutty look really makes me lose my appetite." Jean Wan's heart seemed to be pierced by tens of thousands of needles. Because of his ruthless words, she felt as if there was a gush of blood gushing out of her chest. Even when she was about to die, she was not as desperate and terrible as she was now. "Let go." The man's tone was cold. She held his body, which had become thinner because of his long sleep, tightly circled his waist behind his back, and stubbornly said, "Mo Jingshan, I'm your wife. You can't do this to me." "Wife? Are you?" His voice was cold. "Always." "Ha." The man coldly sneered, put his hand on her hand, and slightly forced it open. "Let go." "I won't let go." However, although he had slept in the hospital for so long, he still had some strength. He directly pried Jean Wan's trembling hand off his waist and ruthlessly threw her aside. When Jean Wan staggered back 2 steps and almost fell, she looked up only to see that the door was opened, and the man's back had already been opened. His long legs spread, and he walked away mercilessly. The door of the ward was opened and closed. Hearing this sound, Jean Wan's mind went blank. Mo Jingshan. Jean Wan stood stiffly in place for a long time. The temperature in the room suddenly seemed to be piercingly cold. Her eyes trembled, and she jerked the door open and chased out. However, when she looked around the corridor outside the ward, she couldn't find Mo Jingshan. He had just woken up. Even if his wounds had healed, it was inevitable that he would still be a little weak. Why did he leave so quickly? Or where did he go? The floor here was very high, and the elevator quietly stopped on the first floor, so he couldn't have entered the elevator just now. Jean Wan's eyes quickly searched everything around her, and her eyes suddenly rested in the direction of the escalator not far away. She hurriedly walked over, opened the door of the escalator, and saw the automatic sensor lights in the escalator instantly turn on, cooling every step that was cold and full of the smell of disinfectant. She couldn't care about anything else and rushed in without thinking. The upstairs were all doctors' offices. He shouldn't have gone there. Maybe he went downstairs. Jean Wan hurriedly ran downstairs, but even after running several floors, she couldn't find Mo Jingshan. Regardless of anything, she ran down every floor and looked into the corridor. She couldn't find him, so she continued to run down. She couldn't find him, couldn't find him, couldn't find him. In her previous life, he had said that he would completely leave her life, and then he disappeared for a whole 10 years. Until she died, she could only hear the news of him returning to China on TV, and she couldn't even see him. Was he going to disappear from her life again? How could it be? Chapter 366. When Feng Ling found Jean Wan was searching every floor like a wandering ghost. Even some family members outside the other wards were startled by her. Mrs. Mo? Feng Ling hurried forward. Jean Wan seemed not to hear her. She turned into the escalator and went down. She had searched more than a dozen floors, and her feet and legs were numb. As soon as she stepped on the stairs, her legs suddenly softened and she staggered forward. Jean Wan. Feng Ling quickly rushed over to support her, but she was still a step too late. One of Jean Wan's knees had just touched the edge of the stairs. Although it was separated by a layer of trousers, she didn't need to lift the trousers to know that it must be bruised. What the hell are you doing? Isn't Mr. Mo awake? What's wrong? Feng Ling pulled her hard until she was dragged to the bench in front of the door of the next floor. She rubbed her legs and looked at her with concern. Jean Wan didn't speak, as if she couldn't feel the pain. Not long after, Jean Wan was forcibly taken to the hospital's lounge by Feng Ling. She called the doctor over to apply some medicine to her knee and then sat by her side to accompany her. Jean Wan was silent for a long time and suddenly leaned her head on Feng Ling's shoulder. She said, "I'm in so much pain." Feng Ling paused and looked down at her. "Where does it hurt? Shall I call the doctor over?" Jean Wan slowly raised her hand and pointed to her heart. Here, Feng Ling frowned and roughly understood what Jean Wan meant. But what she couldn't understand was that Mr. Mo finally woke up. Shouldn't he be happy? Why did Jean Wan look as if she suddenly lost the whole world, like a child abandoned in a corner of the world, so confused? Heartache? Why did she feel heartache? Jean Wan, Feng Ling, I want to be alone for a while. Jean Wan closed her eyes and said softly. Are you worried about High City? Haven't you contacted the Ji family servants? If you're really worried, we can fly back today, visit your father, and then fly back immediately. We can come back in a day or two. Jean Wan smiled bitterly and shook her head. It's all right. Let me be alone for a while. Feng Ling was silent for a moment, stood up, and walked out. There was no one in the lounge, and the sun had just risen. Jean Wan sat quietly for a while, got up, walked out, and entered the elevator. Feng Ling didn't follow her but just watched from the side. When the elevator reached the top floor of the hospital, she immediately frowned. Qin Sighting woke up. In fact, he had slept for less than 2 hours. When he went to the ward, Mo Jingshan was standing by the window. Where is Jean Wan? Did she just come in? Why isn't he outside now? Qin Sighting asked. The man in front of the window did not answer. The room was silent and cold. Qin Sighting narrowed his eyes coldly and then gritted his teeth. Don't tell me you've already said that to her? The man remained silent. Damn it, among us, only you and Jean Wan had a smooth journey and lived a comfortable and happy life. Now that we survived the disaster, shouldn't we cherish the people in front of us more? You can even give up your life for her, and she dares to put herself in the hinterland of a minefield for you. With such deep-rooted feelings, how can you divorce her? Are you *king kidding me? Qin Sighting scolded. Do you want to go down to the sea to accompany me in difficulties because you see me suffering from Shinien's torture? You have to see if Jean Wan agrees or not. She is much more persistent than I thought. She has never wavered or given up on you. How can you just push away such a woman who follows you so firmly? When Nanheng came in, he felt that the ward was a little tense, but the person who was at daggers drawn was Qin Sighting. Mo Jingshan, who had slept for 2 months and had just woken up for a day, just stood silently in front of the window and didn't move. Since you've woken up, you should leave the hospital as soon as possible. Go back to the Mo family to recuperate or go back to High City. I'm really tired of staying in a place like a hospital now. Nanheng said, turned on the light in the ward, and then turned to look at Qin Sighting. You haven't had a good rest these days when he was asleep. Go back to High City and love your Monsieur as soon as possible. Qin Sighting didn't speak but took a deep breath, turned to sit on the sofa by the window, and stared straight at the person in front of the window. Mo Jingshan glanced at him. Why are you so free to meddle in other people's business now? Qin Sighting snorted. I don't necessarily care about other people's business, but I'm one of your attending doctors. Seeing that you, a normal man, seem to have a mental problem after waking up, I'm considering whether to examine your brain again. Nanheng raised his eyebrows. Just now, when he found that Jean Wan was not outside and there were only Mo Jingshan and Qin Sighting in the ward, he guessed that something was wrong, but he didn't know what exactly happened. Now he heard Qin Sighting said that Mo Jingshan had a mental problem. Nanheng sneered, leaned against the door, took out a lighter from his pocket, and played with it. Suddenly, he heard familiar footsteps outside, and he knew it was Feng Ling. At the moment when the door of the ward was knocked, he didn't even need to ask and directly opened the door. Feng Ling stood in front of the door and looked directly at Mo Jingshan in front of the window, saying, Mr. Mo, Mrs. Mo has gone to the rooftop. Nanheng raised his eyebrows in surprise. Went to the rooftop? What was wrong with this woman? Qin Sighting also frowned in an instant. Mo Jingshan, however, looked particularly calm and said indifferently, You are her bodyguard. She went to the rooftop. Why didn't you follow her? What are you doing here? Nanheng, it seemed that he had heard something terrible. Feng Ling said coldly, Mrs. Mo said she wanted to be alone and didn't let me follow her. The view on the rooftop was indeed very broad. Jean Wan stood on it and enjoyed the wind for a while. Then she stood at the edge, found a place to sit against the railing, and stared blankly at half of Los Angeles. She only sat here for a while, probably less than a few minutes, when the metal door on the rooftop was suddenly kicked open with a bang. A gust of wind blew. Jean Wan narrowed her eyes and heard Feng Ling's voice behind her. Mrs. Mo, Mr. Mo asked me to take you down. Chapter 367. Feng Ling came over and stood by Jean Wan's side. If you're in a bad mood, you can tell me or find another way to vent. This place is really not safe. I know it's not safe, so I just sit behind the railing. Jean Wan said slowly. I just want to enjoy the wind here. Besides, she paused and smiled reluctantly. It's useless for you to tell him. He knows I won't seek death easily. He asked you to take me down just to be polite. During the 10 years of wandering, no matter how much she suffered, how she suffered, how she suffered, how she suffered, she never sought death. Her life was tenacious. The only time she sought death was when Ji Mengran destroyed her rationality. She lay in the bathtub, cut her wrists, and foolishly pushed this man away. Even at the last moment of her life, it was because she had taken slow-acting poison for a long time. If she was given the choice, she would choose to live on. She would never take things too hard. Mo Jingshan knew her well. Her heart was hard and her skin was thick. This was the current her in his eyes. Fong Ling's lips moved and she asked curiously, why did it suddenly become like this? Weren't you and Mr. Mo fine before? Yes, why did it become like this? Jean Wan sat cross-legged, looked at the sky, and squeezed out a smile. Her voice was a little hollow. Maybe it's because of cause and effect. God gave me such a beautiful dream, but in the end, he took it back cruelly. Fong Ling didn't understand and didn't ask more. Seeing that Jean Wan was just sitting there obediently and didn't do anything dangerous, she sat down beside her. Jean Wan raised her hand and grasped in the wind. She felt a trace of cold air passing through her palm and then dissipated silently. It was as if she had thought she had finally grasped the happiness in front of her and finally learned to cherish it, but it turned out that it was just like a mass of air. It would dissipate if she said it would dissipate. To be honest, even Jean Wan didn't know how to face the Mo Jingshan 10 years later. Now, except for the loving memories of the past few months, he was still the same old him, the indifferent superior, the man who had completely withdrawn from her life. But could all these beautiful memories really be thrown away like garbage to him? Jean Wan looked at her empty palm for a long time and found that her eyes were very dry. Not even a single tear could fall. The wind is too strong here. Don't sit here for too long, Fong Ling said. I know. Just sit for a while longer. As Jean Wan spoke, she stubbornly raised her hand and caught 2 more times in the wind. This place was too high, and there was not even a speck of dust. The wind swept past her palm, leaving no trace. Mo Jingshan's physical condition was no longer a problem. After he woke up, the doctor conducted a series of examinations and observations on his current condition. After confirming that he could be discharged in a few days, his ward was also transferred to a normal ward. He was no longer restricted from family visits, so his ward was particularly lively these days. Wanju sat by the bed, peeling an apple and talking about what had happened in the past 2 months. Mo Shaoza occasionally answered a call from the company and sat by the bed to ask Mo Jingshan how he was feeling. Kay, Nanhang, and Qin Sighting were busy all over the place. But the man on the bed was always calm and indifferent. At this time, the door opened again. Wanju took a look and said with a smile, Nuan, what's wrong with you these days? When Mo Jingshan was unconscious, you couldn't wait to stay outside for 24 hours every day. Why did you say you were going to rest and sleep these days? You finally woke up and finally relaxed, didn't you? Jean Wan smiled and walked to the bed. Yes, it's rare for me to relax, so I took some time to sleep. She didn't go to sleep, but because the owner of this ward didn't want to see her. Go to sleep. Anyway, Jingshan's body is fine now. There's still us here. You have to take good care of your body. After returning to High City, try to get pregnant as soon as possible. Previously, you often moved the fetus. It's probably because this child is not fated with our Mo family. Mr. Mo still doesn't know what happened, so don't tell him. You and Jingshan are still young. There are too many women at your age who can't keep their babies after only 1 or 2 months. Jingshan's father and I are open-minded. As long as you take good care of your body, you can have another baby at any time. After all, you and Jingshan have always been so close. Hurry up and have another baby so that Mr. Mo can be happy. Wanju said as she handed the peeled apple to Jean Wan. Jingshan doesn't have an appetite. Here, eat it. Jean Wan took it and kept a smile on her face. Thank you. You've been keeping what happened to Jingshan in your heart. I didn't ask you to call me Mom, but it's been so long. Shouldn't you call me Mom? Wanju smiled. Jean Wan's expression faltered, and she glanced at the man on the sickbed, but all she saw was the same indifference as before. Mo Jingshan didn't even look at her from beginning to end. Kay was talking to him, and his eyes were on Kay. If it were in the past, if Wanju asked her to call her Mom, she would definitely do so, but now, even if she wanted to, she suddenly couldn't say it. Her throat was a little dry, and when she saw that Immerse didn't even look at her, she couldn't help clenching the apple in her hand. Oh, look at me. I was too happy these days and forgot that there are too many people here. You must be embarrassed. Let's talk about it when we get home. Wanju took Jinwan's hand with a smile. Jingshan plans to go back to High City next week. Although the doctor said he's fine, I'm still worried. Remember to call me when you go back with him and tell me about his condition. And you've been too thin recently. You must put on a few pounds. Jinwan nodded. Jinwan just nodded and couldn't say a word. Wanju suddenly leaned over to Immerse and said something, but from the way she looked at Jinwan from time to time, Jinwan guessed that she was asking Immerse to treat Jinwan well and have another child as soon as possible. Immerse didn't respond, and Wanju just thought it was inconvenient for him to be too friendly to Jinwan because there were too many people here, so she didn't take it seriously. The ward was very lively, and Jinwan hadn't felt such a lively atmosphere for a long time. Then Immerse suddenly coughed in a low voice, and she subconsciously put down the apple in her hand, turned around, and quickly poured him a glass of water. Immerse looked at the glass of water she handed him and didn't take it. I don't want to drink it. Take it away. Jinwan's hand holding the glass froze awkwardly on the spot. The author's words, 1. The male lead is not dead, nor is he reborn. He just knows a lot of things about his previous life and many things that the female lead doesn't know. Both of them have the memories of 2 lives, and they are complete. 2. Neither of their characters has collapsed, and the plot is still the same as when I wrote the Cambodia novel. It's a plot I've set up in my outline. I'm used to holding back. Although this may cause me to lose some readers who are impatient or can't stand the abuse, thank you for your support, but I still stick to my writing direction. There's no need to tell me in the comments and on Weibo that you're giving up writing. Reading is like watching TV series. If you like it, watch it every day. If you don't, just turn it off. If you're happy, I'm happy. If you're not, I'm not happy. 3. I don't like spoilers, but Mo Tiantan is still the old Mo Tiantan. He just has some memories. For Jinwan, he can even risk his life. How can he not love her when he wakes up? Chapter 368. Wanju took the glass of water and said with a smile, You're really my daughter-in-law. You just won't drink it. You don't even say a word of courtesy. With that, she put the glass aside and turned to look at Jinwan. Sit down and rest. We'll take care of Jingshan. When you return to High City, you'll take care of him. Don't worry. At this time, Qin Sighting entered the ward and said after hearing their conversation, He's fine now. As long as the occasional headache subsides, he'll be fine. Even if he returns to High City, he doesn't need special care. After all, he has been asleep for 2 months. Everything that should be healed has been healed. Wanju nodded happily. That's great. Otherwise, I won't feel at ease to let them go back. Jinwan didn't sit down but took 2 steps back to stand by the window. Qin Sighting said a few more words to Wanju and turned to look at her. Jinwan, come here and help me get the medicine. Okay. Jinwan was really at a loss in this ward. If there were no one else here, she might have a chance to talk to Mo Jingshan. But now she couldn't even get a word in. After leaving the ward, Qin Sighting walked in front and she followed behind. When she went to get the medicine, Qin Sighting glanced back at her. What exactly happened between the 2 of you? Nothing. Just a small matter. It'll be all right after we return to High City. Jinwan lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes at all, and she was obviously not telling the truth. Seeing that she didn't intend to tell him the truth, Qin Sighting didn't ask any more curiously. He handed the medicine to her and patted her on the shoulder. Take care of yourself. Don't be like me. Love is the most difficult thing to deal with. Jean Wan nodded. In her previous life, she was too troublesome. She caused so much trouble in front of Mo Jingshan that he lost all his tolerance and patience for her. The current Mo Jingshan was the Mo Jingshan she had once single-handedly created, a Mo Jingshan who was far beyond her reach. The Mo Jingshan now was so strange that she couldn't feel at ease. He obviously doesn't intend to let his parents know about the current situation between you and him. It seems peaceful here in Los Angeles, but when he returns to High City, I'm afraid many things will be under his control. You'd better be prepared. Although Qin Sighting felt it was cruel, he still said it. I know, but I won't divorce him, never, Jean Wan said softly. Qin Sighting raised his eyebrows. I hope you can hold on. 4 days later, Mo Jingshan was discharged. 3 days later, it would be time for him to return to High City. Mo Jingshan immediately booked a flight back to High City. 3 days after he was discharged from the hospital, after Wan Zhu's repeated persuasion, he finally agreed to stay at the Mo family for a few days. On the day of discharge, the weather was very cold and windy. Many people who had been difficult to enter the ward to visit were waiting in front of the hospital, including the people who settled down. Father An said to Mo Xiaoza with a smile, young people are always in good health. After such a big accident, he will recover after a good rest for 2 months, unlike us, who are old and can't even recover from a fall. Mo Xiaoza smiled. You're right. We have to accept our old age. Our physical quality is different from that of young people. Father An went to greet Mo Jingshan, and Mo Jingshan nodded to him. They had just walked down the stairs in front of the hospital, and there was still a long way to go to the parking place. Jean Wan felt the wind was too strong. She had brought Mo Jingshan's coat, which was in the bag in Kay's hand. Jean Wan turned to take the coat from Kay and quickly came to Mo Jingshan's side. She was about to put the coat on him, but Mo Jingshan took a step forward calmly and avoided the coat she was about to put on him as if he didn't see her. Jean Wan paused and was about to move forward when she suddenly heard An Shuyan say, Jingshan, put on a coat. The wind is too strong. As she spoke, An Shuyan placed a dark gray coat on Mo Jingshan's back. It was unclear if it was newly bought or if she had gone to the Mo family to retrieve it. Mo Jingshan didn't avoid it, and his face was calm, showing no sign of refusal or dissatisfaction. Jean Wan stopped and stood behind the crowd. At this moment, almost no one paid attention to her, and she was the only one who could feel this little indifference and neglect. Mrs. Mo, this coat. Kay came over and handed the bag to her. Why don't you put it in first? Jean Wan handed the coat to Kay and turned to see that An Shuyan was in the crowd. Since she put the coat on Mo Jingshan, she had been walking beside him. When they came to the car door, she raised her hand to help him. When the man's slender figure got into the car, his arm was held by An Shuyan and he didn't move it away. The feeling that a big piece of her heart had been dug out came again. When everyone left, got in the car, and finally got into the car Mo Jingshan took, Mo Jingshan had closed his eyes and sat silently on the leather chair in the car. She didn't know whether he was asleep or just taking a nap, but he didn't look at Jean Wan from beginning to end, as if he didn't care when she got in the car or whether she got in the car or not. This was a high-end limousine, and it was very stable. Right now, there were many people sitting in the car. Although the An family did not come up, Mo Jingshan was still wearing the coat An Shuqian had draped over him. Nuan, is there anything you want to buy? If not, let's go back to the Mo family. You and Jingshan can have a good rest at the Mo family these days before going back to High City, Wanzhu asked in the car. No. Wanzhu signaled the driver to drive. She didn't think there was anything wrong with Mo Jingshan, who was more quiet and indifferent than usual since he woke up, as if he was thousands of miles away from people. On the contrary, Jean Wan was much quieter these days. When they were about to return to the Mo family, Wanzhu took the servant who came with her to buy something, saying that she would make soup for them when they got back. Mo Xiaoza was not in this car, and the driver was also asked by Wanju to help carry the things. After they got out of the car, only Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan were left. It was quiet in the car. In the past few days after Mo Jingshan woke up, his ward had been filled with people. She didn't know if the usually quiet man was deliberately trying to avoid spending time with her alone, but he allowed so many people to wander around his ward. So it was not until now that the two of them had a chance to be alone again. Chapter 369. However, before she could find a topic, Mo Jingshan, who had been sitting there with his eyes closed, spoke. "We'll talk about the divorce when we return to High City. There's no need to mention it here." He did not open his eyes, but his indifferent voice was directed at Jin Wan. Jin Wan's face paled. "Why do we have to divorce?" At this time, the man opened his eyes, but there was no warmth in his indifferent eyes, cold and dark. "Haven't we divorced before?" "But we haven't. The past is in the past for me. I only recognize the present." Jin Wan looked at him and said firmly, "I won't divorce." The man looked at her coldly. His distant and indifferent eyes were like icy thorns. Jin Wan slowly clenched her hands and suddenly asked, Did you really marry another woman?" She did not dare to ask whether it was in Shuyan, Ji Mengran, or anyone else. Just this tentative question had torn her heart into pieces, and she could barely put it back together. The man's black eyes looked at her, and gradually emitted traces of mockery. "What do you think?" For simple words chilled Jin Wan's heart to the bottom. Was he admitting it or was he simply mocking her? She couldn't understand these words at all. Just like the current Mo Jingshan, she couldn't understand him at all. This man was not a simple person to begin with, and now he was even more unfathomable and difficult to understand. She was silent for a moment, slowly clenched her hands on her lap, and insisted, "I won't divorce, Mo Jingshan. Whether in America or back to High City, I won't divorce." The man looked at her coldly and did not speak again. At this time, the car door had been opened. When Jin Wan looked at him again, she saw that he had closed his eyes to rest again. Obviously, he did not intend to waste time on such a useless topic and quarrel with her. He didn't even want to say a word to her. Los Angeles, the Mo family. It was noon when they arrived at the Mo family home. The servants had prepared lunch. No one else followed them. When they got out of the car and walked into the Mo family home, they were alone. Ms. Wanju, who had been in a good mood all the way, entered the door with the servants carrying shopping bags. "You've been eating hospital meals or takeout from nearby hotels these days. It's been a long time since you had a good meal at home. Hurry up and eat," Wanju said as she handed the shopping bags into the kitchen and told the servants to wash the bought ingredients. She would find time in the afternoon to cook. Then Wanju looked back at Jin Wan, who seemed to be waiting for the elders to sit down. She smiled, walked over, and sat down, and motioned for Jin Wan to sit next to Mo Jingshan. Jin Wan glanced at Mo Jingshan before sitting down, only to see that the man was just sitting there silently and didn't look at her. Since he said he wouldn't mention the divorce in the Mo family, he probably didn't intend to keep too much distance from her. She hesitated for a moment and then sat down beside him. However, the distance between the dining chairs and their bodies was only about half a meter, but it felt like 10 years had passed. Beside her was a person that she could never reach even if she exhausted both of her lives. The servants served the lunch that they had prepared, filling up the entire table. Jin Wan put a bowl of the medicated diet specially made for her and Mo Jingshan and put it in front of Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan glanced at it and didn't take it. "Jingshan, get some chicken soup for Jin Wan. She needs nourishment. Even if we go back to High City, ask Auntie Chen to make chicken soup for her every few days. It's best if it's black chicken soup. It's very good for women," Wanju said and winked at Mo Jingshan. Really, this guy used to love his wife so much, but after sleeping for 2 months, he seemed to have become dull in love. Not only did he not spoil Jean Wan as passionately as before, but he didn't even give her a bowl of chicken soup that was so close to his hand. Mo Jingshan didn't seem to hear her. Jean Wan smiled to ease her embarrassment. No, I've drunk a lot these days. My mouth is almost spoiled by you. Don't you have more in the evening? I'll drink your soup tonight. This child, you're so sweet. You want to drink my soup, don't you? Then I'll make more for you tonight. Jean Wan nodded, picked up a piece of fish tofu that was very close to her hand, and put it in Mo Jingshan's bowl. Mo Jingshan hadn't lifted his chopsticks yet. When their chopsticks collided, Jean Wan saw that the fish tofu fell directly into his bowl and was about to take back her chopsticks. However, the man suddenly put down the chopsticks in his hand and said indifferently, "Bring me another pair of chopsticks." Jean Wan. A minute later, she watched the man use the new pair of chopsticks to pick out the fish tofu she had just picked up and didn't eat it. Only then did Wan Zhu and Mo Shaoza notice that there seemed to be something wrong between the two of them, but they just thought that the young couple might be quarreling. They didn't care about or participate in this kind of quarrel between husband and wife, so they didn't ask more questions but just smiled and asked them to eat more to nourish their bodies. Then Jean Wan didn't continue to put food in Mo Jingshan's bowl. She ate some silently and put down the bowl, unable to eat anymore. "Why do you eat so little?" Wan Zhu asked. "It's a lot." Jean Wan didn't have an appetite, and now her appetite was even worse because of her mood. "You've lost weight recently. Although I persuaded you to go back to the Mo family to rest in the days before Jingshan woke up, you ate very little every day. I felt sorry for you when I saw you didn't eat or sleep well. Now that Jingshan is fine, why do you still eat so little?" Wan Zhu said as she put some more food in Jean Wan's bowl. "Good girl, eat more. You can't lose weight like this." Jean Wan had to eat a little more, but she really couldn't eat any more and put down the chopsticks after a few more mouthfuls. At this time, Mo Jingshan got up to answer the phone. Jean Wan sat at the table and was about to get up, when Wan Zhu suddenly asked in a voice that only she could hear, "Did you quarrel with Jingshan?" Jean Wan paused and shook her head. "No. If it was just a quarrel, it would be fine, but now Mo Jingshan didn't even want to quarrel with her." Wan Zhu had obviously seen Mo Jingshan treat Jean Wan so well a while ago, but now he suddenly treated Jean Wan coldly. Although she felt it was a little strange to see Mo Jingshan being so cold in front of his wife, she still comforted Jean Wan. "Don't take it to heart. It's inevitable that there will be friction between husband and wife. Be patient. If Jingshan bullies you after returning to High City, call me and I'll fly over to help you." Chapter 370. In the afternoon, Mo Jingshan and Mo Shaoza talked about Shine Group, while Jean Wan followed Wan Zhu around the Mo home. In the evening, she went to the kitchen with Wan Zhu to pick vegetables. The servants of the Mo family were used to the hostess taking the initiative to go to the kitchen. They cleaned up everything in the kitchen and let the two of them work as much as they wanted. After dinner, Jean Wan went back to the bedroom. She wanted to wait for Mo Jingshan to come back to have a good talk with him. But after waiting for a long time, he didn't return to the bedroom. It was already 9:00 in the evening, so Jean Wan had to go to the bathroom to take a shower. Halfway through the shower, she vaguely heard the bedroom door open and close. Her heart paused, knowing that Mo Jingshan had come in. She didn't dawdle, sped up the shower, wrapped herself in a bath towel, and went straight out of the bathroom. As soon as she went out, she saw the man standing neatly dressed in the bedroom. Apparently, he turned his eyes because he heard the sound in the bathroom. When he saw the bath towel on Jean Wan, his eyes were cold. "Put on your clothes and then come out." Jean Wan, they had been married for so long. Wasn't it normal to come out with a bath towel wrapped around her? She used to be carried into the bathroom after being harshly bullied by him on the bed, and then he carried her out naked. What did she say at that time? Jean Wan thought about it, picked up her clothes, went back to the bathroom, put on her pajamas, and blew her hair until it was half dry. When she came out, she saw that Immerse was standing in front of the bedroom window. Outside the window was a huge balcony. He didn't go out. His slender figure stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. His back was familiar, but also strange. She ran her fingers through her half-dry hair and walked over. "Can we have a good talk? It's getting late. Go to sleep. I'll go to the study to deal with some business after taking a shower." Immerse didn't look at her. When Jin-won approached, he avoided her and turned to the study. Jin-won was silent for a moment and asked, "Aren't you going to sleep?" The man's back was cold and full of alienation. "You sleep on the bed. I'll sleep in the study." His answer was decisive and straightforward, and even the last connection between husband and wife with Jin-won seemed to be severed by him in an instant. The sound of water came from the bathroom. Jin-won was still standing in front of the window. She turned to look at the bathroom and took a long time to calm down before she went to get 2 sets of clothes, walked over, and gently knocked on the bathroom door. The sound of water in the bathroom immediately stopped. "What is it?" The man's deep and cold voice came from inside. "You didn't take a change of clothes out. Put it at the door. It's a bit cold in the room. It's better to come out after you're done. I'll bring it in for you." "No need." For a moment, Jin-won heard a hint of decisiveness in his voice. She gritted her teeth. Today, she had been provoked by Immerse. "Are you afraid that you have too many wounds and don't want me to see them, or do you want to keep a distance from me to the point where we can't even be husband and wife?" There was silence in the bathroom, and the sound of water continued. Obviously, he had no intention of answering her. Jin-won angrily put his clothes down on the table in front of the door and turned back to the bed. When she sat down on the bed, she did not lift the quilt to lie down but just stared at the bathroom, listening to the sound of water in it. She was really angry, but she didn't know whether to be angry at herself for pushing this man so far away or at Immerse, who could be so heartless now. Jin-won picked up her cell phone and flipped through it. The text messages she had sent him when he was unconscious were all read. He saw them all, but he didn't reply to her text messages, nor did he reply verbally. Was it because when he opened his eyes again, he had already remembered everything in the past, so when he saw her dozens of messages, it was as if he was watching a huge joke? When the sound of water stopped, Jin-won stared at the bathroom. Not long after, the man opened the door, took in a change of clothes, and came out dressed. His hair had been dried, but it was still a little wet. His ink-black hair seemed to have a faint cold brilliance, as if Jin-won did not exist in this bathroom. After coming out, he went straight into the study. Jin-won remembered that when she had just been reborn, it wasn't easy for her to coax Immerse home from the company, but he also lived in the study or slept in another bedroom. 10 years ago, they slept in separate rooms because she wanted a divorce, and he avoided her temper and let her sleep alone. As long as she changed her ideas and practices and tried to cherish the life with him, the pace of their marriage would slowly return to happiness and stability. But 10 years later, they had divorced and hadn't seen each other for 10 years. How could she stand by Immerse's side? He had long been the global executive president of the Shine Group, a superior who was much more powerful than the MO Corporation. His calmness, indifference, heartlessness, and means were definitely more unpredictable than what he had been 10 years ago. He controlled everything, but no one could control him anymore. The Immerse she knew was him, but now Immerse had become the one she was extremely unfamiliar with. She couldn't understand, let alone understand. The two of them were very close, but they seemed to be separated by thousands of mountains and rivers. The door of the study was closed. She couldn't see inside, but she really couldn't sleep, so she sat on the bed and took out a box of burn ointment from the drawer. She had never had the patience to apply this thing. The doctor also said that the burn marks on her hands would disappear naturally in a few months. If she insisted on applying this ointment, they would disappear faster. She slowly applied the ointment on her hands, and a faint medicinal fragrance came into her nose. She stared at her hands and suddenly couldn't remember when was the last time she held hands with Mo Jingshan. It seemed that it had been a long time. Last time, at that dinner party, he had been holding her hand tightly and keeping her by his side, never far away. But at this moment, not to mention holding hands, even touching chopsticks made him want to change to a new pair. As if she were a plague. Even when they slept, they didn't sleep in the same room. Jean Wan resisted the throbbing pain in her heart. Considering that Mo Jingshan had just been discharged from the hospital and needed to rest in a comfortable bed more than she did, she got up and sat down on the fabric sofa in the bedroom. After looking at her phone for a while, she looked up at the door of the study, which was closed and quiet. It was like an insurmountable barrier. Chapter 371. For some reason, Jean Wan felt as though everything had returned to the past. She opened her eyes in a daze, watching the person so close to her. After a long while, she gradually woke up. When she raised her eyes again, she saw the man's gaze on her. It was a very, very faint gaze. She did not know how long he had been standing here and how long he had been watching her. "Are you done?" She resisted the urge to lean into his arms at such a close distance and asked sleepily. "Why didn't you sleep on the bed?" The man's low and cold voice was even colder than the night outside the window. Jean Wan woke up again and tugged the thin blanket covering her. She was still curled up on the sofa, but because she had just woken up, her nasal voice was very heavy. "You've just been discharged from the hospital. It shouldn't be comfortable to sleep in the study. So, I'll let you sleep on the bed." The man silently watched her for a moment and said calmly, "In my upbringing, there's no such thing as a man sleeping on the bed and a woman sleeping on the sofa. Go back to the bed." The first sentence was somewhat distant and polite, but the last sentence was like a command. It was very similar to the Mo Jingshan who usually urged her to eat and sleep. Jean Wan was quiet. She gripped the corner of the blanket, her voice slightly hoarse. "Between us, when did we reach the point where we need to be so polite?" The man's pitch-black and calm eyes watched her quietly. "Otherwise? Do you want to sleep on the bed with me? Or do you want something to happen between us tonight? We're husband and wife, aren't we?" Jean Wan directly looked into his eyes. However, the man's indifferent gaze quickly made her realize that she was being unrequited. "I'm afraid you haven't found your place." The man's unique cold fragrance was right in front of her, but after saying this, he directly turned and walked away. Finally, the door to the study opened and closed. Jean Wan curled up on the sofa, watching the door and then turning to look at the empty bed. During this period, Mo Jingshan and Jean Wan were like strangers. However, the Mo family gradually exerted pressure on the Su family, causing the Su family to seal off the news. Even Elder Su could not control the invisible net that was being cast on his granddaughter. When Elder Su could no longer bear it and directly came to the Mo family, Mo Jingshan did not avoid him. However, there was a hint of a smile in his dark eyes. This smile was unfathomable. He had always been a person that Elder Su could not understand and deal with. At this moment, he especially felt that Mo Jingshan, who had only woken up after sleeping for 2 whole months, seemed to be even more decisive and ruthless than before. "Shui has already died in that car. This case can't be closed just like that. Do you really want to fight to the death with our Su family?" Elder Su looked at Mo Shaoza, who had gradually found out the truth, and then at Mo Jingshan. He gritted his teeth and tried to fight for more opportunities for Su Zhilan. However, Mo Jingshan only coldly curved his lips. Everything went on as usual. In the days after Mo Jingshan woke up, the Su family had been turned upside down. When Elder Su wanted to come again, he could no longer see Mo Jingshan. The Mo family's door and Shine's door had also clearly forbidden the Su family. In the 3 days before returning to High City, the evidence that Su Zhilan had hired a hitman to kill Su Zhilan was more accurately confirmed. All the medicine Su Shui had taken before her death, all the hospital diagnoses, and all the evidence related to Su Zhilan's plan were laid out one by one. In the face of the Mo family's means and evidence, Elder Su was powerless. Su Zhilan was grounded in the Su family as a suspect and taken to the police station. All the evidence of the crime was presented one by one. She could not defend herself no matter how hard she tried to find an excuse. Knowing that the real murderer behind the scenes might really be Su Zhilan, Su Shui's parents flew into a rage and ran to the police station to expose many things of the Su family, including many things between Su Zhilan and Su Shui. Jin Wan lost a child. So within a week after Mo Jingshan woke up, the Su family completely changed. Su Zhilan was convicted. Elder Su was so angry that he fell into a coma and was sent to the hospital for emergency treatment. Su Shui was finally able to leave the Forensic Institute and was taken home by her parents to be buried. Mo Jingshan's swift and decisive actions, as well as his precise judgment and means, made Mo Shaozi feel ashamed of his inferiority. He asked him several times when he would come back to take over Shine. In the past, Mo Jingshan would never answer this question. Before returning to High City, Mo Jingshan watched Jin Wan get into the car and said after a long time, "Don't touch my people. In 2 years, the Mo Corporation will merge with Shine, and 2 years later, I will take over Shine." Mo Shaozi raised his eyebrows and looked at him abruptly. "Are you sure?" Mo Jingshan's cold voice gradually became full of sarcasm. "If I don't come back to take over Shine in 2 years, I'm afraid that with the prestige you have built up and the penetration rate in recent years, you won't be able to resist the attack of the 2 internet companies, VK and Huahong. Give me 2 years, and they will collapse in front of the Mo Corporation. They won't even be qualified to compete with Shine." Although Shine was the largest Chinese company in the Chinese world in the United States, in recent years, there had been major changes in the domestic and foreign industries, and many of them were turning to the internet and technology. At his age, Mo Shaozi didn't know much about these things, and his penetration rate was very low. If Shine continued to be in his hands, in a few years, it would fall in the torrent of these industry changes sooner or later. It was not as promising as the Mo Corporation that Mo Jingshan had supported, so it was indeed the best choice for Mo Corporation to merge with Shine and let Mo Jingshan take over. However, Mo Jingshan had never given a direct response, so Mo Shaozi had always thought that he would never take over Shine and had been worried whether the Mo family century-old foundation would be destroyed in his hands. And now, Mo Jingshan's words had put Mo Shaozi's mind at ease. When they got on the plane back to High City at the same time as Mo Jingshan, Feng Ling had a mission in the United States and would go to High City to see Jin Wan after a while. The plane had been flying for several hours. The blue sky and white clouds outside the window looked so beautiful, but the man beside Jin Wan remained silent. The two boarded the plane together in front of Wan Zhu and Mo Shaozi. After getting on the plane, the man didn't say a word to her. Chapter 372. Mo Jingshan recovered quickly. Perhaps sleeping motionlessly like this for 2 months really left a lot of space for the wounds on his body to heal, unlike before, when his wounds were torn open at any time. Now, except that he was a little thinner than when he was in High City, he was no different from before. He was still as cold and noble as she remembered, and still the man she was familiar with. The only difference was that he no longer smiled at her, and his gaze no longer lingered on her. Even though they were sitting on the same plane, even though the two of them were sitting in the same row, and he was right next to her, it felt like they were very, very far apart. Jin Wan sat for a while and suddenly put her hand on his leg. The man opened his eyes and stared at her with heavy eyes. "What are you doing?" Jin Wan looked at her hand on his leg and then at his displeased, heavy eyes. She pursed her lips and said, "Excuse me. I want to go to the bathroom." Even though the first-class seats were spacious, he was tall and had long legs, and he was sitting on the outside of the aisle. If he didn't step aside, she wouldn't be able to go out at all. Mo Jingshan took another look at her and moved his leg away. Jin Wan withdrew her hand resentfully. When she got up, the plane must have passed through an area with turbulence. Perhaps unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, Jean Wan staggered and fell into his arms. Although she didn't fall so hard, she still pressed her hands on his legs and leaned forward, almost leaning into his arms, and their faces were only a finger's distance apart. At such a distance, the man looked at her deadpan. Jean Wan's heart pounded, but she said calmly, "Sorry, I didn't stand still." Mo Jingshan. Before getting up, Jean Wan's hand purposely pressed down hard on his thigh. She pressed down hard on this golden thigh that she was not allowed to touch earlier before getting up. She turned and went to the private restroom not far from the first-class cabin. Standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, Jean Wan smiled at the mirror. She felt that her smile was not very good, so she raised her hand to pull up the corners of her mouth. She didn't put down her hand until she was satisfied with it. They were going back to High City, back to their original world, their original life. Divorce? Of course she wouldn't. But if she kept being alienated by him like this, it seemed that she couldn't maintain the status quo forever. In this marriage, self-esteem, face, and strength were not important. Besides, Mo Jingshan had done everything for her, whether she was aware of it or not. Not long ago, he had almost died for her. If she compromised and left so easily now, she would really let him and herself down. Since they were husband and wife, it was a legal relationship. At most, he would let her chase after him. If he retreated, she would advance. If he was cold, she would warm. If he avoided, she would take the initiative. If he was expressionless, she would smile. As Mrs. Mo, couldn't she climb into his bed legally? As long as she wanted to take the initiative, no matter how powerful he was, he would not be able to remove her from the spouse column unless she agreed to a divorce. Jean Wan smiled at the mirror for a while. Feeling that her smile was natural and beautiful, she walked out. When she returned to her seat, the moment Mo Jingshan got up, Jean Wan happened to walk past him. She looked up at his cold face and suddenly stood on tiptoe to whisper in his ear, "Honey, after several days of careful consideration, I've finally made up my mind." Hearing this, the man glanced at her calmly, his eyes a little like looking at a lunatic. Jean Wan had prepared herself and was ready to fight back. Facing his eyes, she smiled and looked into his quiet, black eyes, saying in a low voice, "I've decided, even if you put a knife to my neck, I won't agree to divorce you." The man was expressionless just now, but because of her words, he became as cold as usual. Without waiting for him to speak, Jean Wan slipped back to her seat, fastened her seatbelt, picked up a magazine in front of her, and flipped through it, looking forward to flying back to High City as soon as possible. Mo Jingshan didn't say anything, and on the plane, he didn't intend to discuss too much with her about a divorce. After reading the magazine for a while, Jean Wan patted him and asked him to ask the flight attendant for a glass of water, a blanket, or a headset. Almost every half an hour, she would try to talk to him. Although the man always turned a blind eye to her, Jean Wan still happily patted his hand after half an hour. Mo Jingshan's expression became colder and he glanced at her. Jean Wan put the magazine in front of him solemnly, pointed to the French paragraph on the last page of the magazine, and asked, "I haven't learned French, so I don't know this. Don't you know many languages? What's this paragraph about?" The man looked at her clumsy acting skills and pure attitude of trying to find something to talk about and completely ignored her. Jean Wan pointed to the French paragraph and asked, "Just translate it into Chinese for me. I don't think it's very long. It's just 2 or 3 sentences at most." Mo Jingshan glanced at the words she was pointing at. His gaze deepened, but he did not translate it for her. The plane would land in High City in about 3 hours. Jean Wan kept looking at the passage. On the other side of the aisle sat a French student with a Chinese-French dictionary in his hand. Jean Wan borrowed the dictionary and read it word by word. Finally, she took a pen and wrote down the translated content on her boarding pass. Koi kilspas sayun personatamari element, ella reviendrata save cletumps. No matter what happens, if someone truly loves you, as time passes, she will eventually come back. Jean Wan returned the dictionary to the French student and then placed the words she had just written in front of Mo Jingshan. She looked at him with a burning gaze. Did I translate it correctly? Mo Jingshan glanced at the row of beautiful words she had written on the boarding pass and did not speak for a long time. His gaze was cold and indifferent. In the end, when Jean Wan approached to ask him, he looked at her. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, enough to cut her. His tone was indifferent. There are many ways to interpret French. People who think they're passionate will usually translate a simple sentence into something extremely romantic. In short, it's all because they're passionate. Chapter 373. High City. It had only been a few short months, but it felt like half a lifetime ago. As soon as he returned, Mo Jingshan went straight to the Mo Corporation. He did not even return to the Yu Garden, nor did he ask about Jean Wan. Jean Wan returned to the Yu Garden to tidy up and planned to go to the Ji home. Before returning, she learned that Ji Hongwen had been discharged. Recently, the Ji Corporation had been handed over to the vice president to manage, and Ji Hongwen would most likely be resting at home for a while. Before returning to the Ji home, she called Mo Jingshan, only to find that his private number was turned off. Not many people called his private number. Even if grandfather Mo wanted to call him, he would usually call his work number, office phone, or directly call the Yu Garden's landline. This number was usually used to contact her. She called Shenmu, only to learn that Mo Jingshan went straight to the conference room after going to the company. He had not returned for a long time, and there were many problems waiting for him to deal with. Jean Wan did not receive Mo Jingshan's call the entire afternoon. Even when Shenmu told him that she had called, he did not call her back. Before the sky turned dark, Jean Wan returned to the Ji family. Ji Hongwen's health was much better. Ever since she went to T-City, she hadn't been back for about half a year. There was still no news from Ji Mengran. It had only been half a year, but Ji Hongwen seemed to have aged 10 years. Shenmu said that CEO Mo would most likely have a meeting tonight. It was uncertain if it would end before noon tomorrow, so she did not plan to return tonight and simply stayed at the Ji home to accompany Ji Hongwen. Shenharu had already been chased away. It was said that not long after she was chased away, she was picked up by Xingyihan. As expected, this pair of mother and son had not truly severed their mother-son relationship after so many years. Ji Hongwen still needed to rest for a while. Jean Wan found that he would watch the aviation news before going to bed. Although he did not say it, Ji Mengran was his biological daughter after all. She had been missing for so long without any news, and it had not been confirmed that she had really died. He had always been worried about her. Therefore, she also checked the news before going to bed and found that Ji Mengran really seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was no news of her anywhere. Her name was not on the list of victims of the plane crash. Even at the airline press conference, no one mentioned her name. Mo Jingshan held meetings in the company for several days, and Jean Wan stayed at the Ji home for a few days. Ji Hongwen was able to get out of bed occasionally because of her return and company. When spring came, he would often walk around the front yard with Jean Wan's help, or sit in a wheelchair and be pushed by Jean Wan to the nearby shopping malls, supermarkets, parks, and other places to relax. A week later, Ji Hongwen's physical and mental condition were much better, and he decided to return to the company after a few more days of rest. Jean Wan took some time to go to the studio. In the evening, she was dragged downstairs by Xia Tian and Xiao Ba to eat a lot of food, and her stomach was almost bursting. After returning to the Yu Garden by car, Auntie Chen asked her if she wanted to eat. Jean Wan rubbed her stomach and shook her head. No, I ate too much at night. Now I can't even drink a mouthful of water. Auntie Chen smiled and asked her to take advantage of the good weather tonight to take a stroll in the Yu Garden to digest. However, Jean Wan knew that Mo Jingshan did not continue the meeting today and thought that he would return to the Yu Garden today, but she went upstairs and searched all the bedrooms but found no trace of him. Hasn't Imo Jingshan come back these days? Jin Wan asked. No. He hasn't come back these days when I'm not here? No. It had been a week since he returned to High City. He could attend meetings and work overtime, but since there was no meeting today, he didn't even plan to return to the Yew Garden. Was he trying to avoid the opportunity to meet her? Jin Wan thought about it. Although she didn't know if he was really busy, and she was not the kind of person who was particularly used to calling often, she still picked up her cell phone and called Imo Jingshan. His private number was still turned off. She dialed the number of his studio. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. But now it was time to get off work, and Jin Wan couldn't disturb Shenmu at this time. She hesitated, and without taking off her coat or changing her shoes, she turned and went out. Hey, Mrs. Imo, you just came back, and you're leaving again? Auntie Chen finally saw the hostess of the house come back. Seeing Jin Wan turn and leave again, she was worried and hurriedly chased after her to ask. I'll go to the Mo Corporation to have a look, Jin Wan replied, went straight to the parking lot, and drove out by herself. Seeing Jin Wan drive the car away, Auntie Chen stood on the spot and sighed. Although Mrs. Imo didn't live in the Yew Garden these days, if it were in the past, Mr. Imo would definitely find time to call back and ask if Jin Wan had returned to the Yew Garden. However, these days, Jin Wan returned to the Ji family, but Mr. Imo not only didn't return to the Yew Garden, but also didn't even call. The white Audi sped along the road. It didn't take long to drive to the Mo Corporation. Jin Wan stopped the car, got out of the car, and closed the door. She stood in the square opposite the Mo Corporation building for a while, looking at the top floor, which was not lit. She hesitated before walking in. She went to the company's security room and asked if Imo Jingshan was in the company. The security guard knew Jin Wan and knew that she was Mrs. Imo, so he answered truthfully, CEO Imo is not in the company. Not in the company? Then where did he go? I saw his car was still there. Jin Wan glanced at the familiar black ghost in the parking lot. CEO Mo has been in meetings for several days in a row, and it's rare for him to take a break today. He planned to live in the office break room, but some time ago, the office glass on each floor of the company was reinforced, and some simple new decoration was carried out. There may be some smell of solidified glue, so CEO Mo didn't live here. Okay, thank you. Jin Wan didn't ask more, turned to walk down the steps, and then looked in the direction of Aolan International, which was not far from the Mo Corporation. As far as she knew, apart from the Yew Garden, the only place where he lived was Aolan International. If he didn't drive, only Aolan International was the nearest place. She didn't continue driving. Instead, she turned around and walked in that direction. When she crossed the road, her eyes fell on the fruit store across the road. She then glanced at the supermarket below the apartment building and went in to buy some fruits and ingredients. When she was buying ingredients in the supermarket, she handed over the money to the shop owner. The shop owner clearly remembered her. After all, Mo Jingshan had come here with her. At that time, he bought some onions, ginger, and garlic and handed a black card to the proprietress. After shopping, Jin Wan entered the apartment, entered the elevator, and went upstairs. When she arrived at the floor where Mo Jingshan lived, as soon as she walked out, she saw that the door of the apartment was closed. Although she knew the password and could unlock the door with her fingerprint, she still raised her hand and rang the doorbell. Chapter 374. The man was damp, handsome, and clean. It seemed that the coldness of these days had faded away in an instant. His hair was half wet, and his eyes were calm, and he seemed to have become the old Mo Jingshan again. However, the moment he saw that the person standing outside the door was her, his eyes turned cold. What are you doing here? Obviously, he had been busy in the company for several days and held meetings for several days. He should have just returned to Aolan International to rest. There was more or less some fatigue in his eyes, but the coldness in his black eyes was as cold as ever. Auntie Chen said you haven't been back to the Yew Garden these days. I know you haven't been back to the company for a long time and have a lot of things to deal with. You must be busy and tired these days. Just now, I passed by your company and heard that you had left, so I guessed you should be here, so I bought some food and necessities. You must have come back in a hurry and didn't buy them. Jean Wan said and showed him the shopping bag in her hand. Mo Jingshan's eyes swept over her face indifferently. Because of her passing by, he seemed to be a little sarcastic, but he didn't expose her. Can I come in? The man was silent for 2 seconds and said coldly, if I say no, will you leave now? Of course I won't leave. Then she saw the man's slightly mocking expression, and then he turned and walked in. Although he left the door open for her, he didn't mean to welcome her. At the moment he turned around, Jean Wan finally saw the wounds on his back. Although the wounds had already healed, there were still scars left behind, regardless of whether it was light or heavy. She didn't know how long it would take for these wounds and scars to disappear, but each of them had left an indelible mark in Jean Wan's life. No matter how he treated her now, he was Mo Jingshan, her Mo Jingshan. How could she give up so easily, and how could she escape because of these little setbacks? Jean Wan went straight into the door. Nothing in Aolan International had changed. That's right. She hadn't lived here for so long, and he hadn't come back either. Usually, there wouldn't be any changes except that someone would come and clean the place. Mo Jingshan went back to the bathroom to continue drying his hair. Jean Wan took the things she bought into the kitchen, and when she came out, Mo Jingshan had entered the bedroom. He didn't even look at her, as if her arrival was like a servant or a nanny who had just come back from shopping, and he didn't need to worry about asking or answering a word or half a sentence. Jean Wan simply asked him through the bedroom door, have you finished all the work that has piled up in the company? The bedroom was quiet. There was no response. Jean Wan asked again, when do you plan on returning to the Yew Garden? Not long after, the bedroom door opened, and the tall and slender man came out. He was no longer only wearing a bath towel. He had put on a shirt and black pants. Jean Wan found that since he woke up, he seemed to be wearing black, and the light-colored or white shirts he occasionally wore were almost untouched. Was it because he was only used to wearing black in the following years? In the past, when he wore this color, he only looked noble and aloof, making it hard for people to get close to him. Now, looking at him, it felt like he was a cold machine, emotionless and emotionless. It was like a black barrier had been erected between them, and she couldn't get close even if she wanted to. Because Jean Wan had been staring at him, Mo Jingshan walked out of the bedroom and was about to pick up the phone, but because of her gaze, he turned to look at her. It was a very indifferent look, as if he was troubled by the sudden appearance of another person in his place. You've been here, and you've seen it. Why don't you leave? It's raining outside. I've lived here before, and even the password is my birthday. I'll stay here with you tonight, can't I? Jean Wan asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Mo Jingshan looked out of the window. High City had entered spring, and the spring rain was biting. Jean Wan's body couldn't stand the cold, so it was best not to go out at this time. He didn't say more, put down the phone he had just picked up, and seemed to hesitate for half a second before picking it up again. At the same time, he picked up the suit jacket on the sofa, put it in the crook of his arm, and straightened up to leave. Jean Wan stared at his back and suddenly stepped forward. When he was about to go out, she suddenly jumped up to him, put her back against the door, and stared at him. Where are you going? Because of her actions, Mo Jingshan faintly furrowed his cold brows. Move aside. It's raining outside. Are you going out? You stay here. I'll go back to the company. Jean Wan stared at him, and if her eyes could shoot fire, she really wanted to roast his frozen heart. Mo Jingshan, is there a virus in me? Do you have to hide from me like this? Although Aolan International is not the Yew Garden, it is also our common home, isn't it? You set the password of this apartment door by yourself. You set my birthday, which means you agree that this apartment belongs to the two of us. Now because I'm here, you want to leave? The man pursed his lips indifferently and looked at her eyes that had been staring at him. I'll change the password. Jean Wan widened her eyes. You want to change the password? Mo Jingshan didn't talk nonsense and said impatiently, get out of the way. I won't get out of the way. Jean Wan stubbornly guarded the door. Do you want to leave? Do you want to keep a distance from me? All right, no matter how high the floor here is, it can't be as high as the 33rd floor. If you have the ability, jump down or climb down yourself. Anyway, I even dare to climb up to the 33rd floor. To avoid me, what's there to be afraid of? Go jump down yourself. Go jump. I won't stop you. The man's eyes were fixed on her face. Perhaps because of her words, he was silent for a few seconds, but after a few seconds, he still looked cold and ruthless. Jean Wan, pestering me won't do you any good. Don't be so unreasonable. I'm protecting my marriage. I'm stopping my man from leaving me. Is this pestering? Mo Jingshan, I'm your wife. Soon I won't be, he said indifferently. I've been too busy to deal with your problem these days. Now that you've come to find me, I'll go back to the company tomorrow morning and bring the divorce agreement to you. Remember to sign it. Jean Wan looked at him and said clearly, I won't divorce you. Never. Chapter 375. You know that I wasn't completely in charge of that incident. You also know that I was under the influence of drugs and my mental state wasn't very good. You also know that Ji Mengran was behind it. You know everything. Jean Wan was not irritated by his words at all. Instead, she stared at his black eyes more seriously and said firmly, I didn't do anything evil or against my principles except that I tried to divorce you and did some unreasonable things that really made you angry. There's no reason for me to be rejected by you like this. No matter in the past or now, I'm your wife. Mo Jingshan. I won't agree to divorce you. She stood in front of the door and had no intention of moving away. Mo Jingshan looked at her silently for a moment and didn't want to waste any more time with her. He turned around and threw his suit jacket back on the sofa. The rain was still falling outside the window. The pitter-patter of rain made this place even quieter. Life can't be repeated. You just have to treat everything that happened in the past 10 months as a dream. It's better for us to return to the beginning. He didn't want to argue with her, but he also didn't want to talk too much nonsense with her. How could it be a dream? The man I love is right in front of me. It hurts when you're hurt. It hurts when I pinch myself. You're right here. You're not a dream, and neither am I. Jean Wan looked at his cold and resolute back. You're you, my husband. The man I love. You'd better agree to divorce. If you're afraid that the G family will go bankrupt and that your studio can't afford your unknown life, I can transfer half of MO Corporation's shares to your name, even if. He paused. The MO Jingshan of the past 10 months is the last gift I gave you. He said these words with his back to her. Jean Wan couldn't see his expression but could only hear the indifference and heartlessness in his tone. The Mo Jingshan of the past 10 months. Look how cleanly he brushed himself off. He spoke as if this person was not himself. It was too painful, really. Jean Wan raised her finger and gently rubbed the corner of her eyes. She couldn't tell whether she was angry or sad. She pulled herself together and said, I definitely won't divorce. It's already so late, and I don't want to keep talking about this topic. I'm hungry. You haven't eaten since you came from the company, right? Let's eat, shall we? You eat by yourself, I'm not hungry. How could I not be hungry? You've always been so busy in the company that you forget to eat and sleep. You can't even avoid eating just because I'm here, right? I just bought some ingredients and fruits from the small supermarket downstairs. Since it's raining outside and we can't go out, why don't we cook something simple at home? The man unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt. His back was still facing her, and he didn't even look at her. Up to you. With that, he went straight to the study. Seeing him close the door of the study, Jean Wan pursed her lips and stood in the living room looking at the door. She had brought all sorts of ingredients here, perhaps subconsciously thinking that Immerse would cook for her. But now, it seemed that he could only cook for her in his dreams if she wanted him to cook for her again. What had gotten into her head that he would roll up his sleeves and go into the kitchen? Perhaps life hadn't given her enough blows to face the cruel reality, so she still had fantasies. But fortunately, he didn't leave and didn't really leave her here alone. She had to be content. Jean Wan comforted herself and then went into the kitchen alone. She washed her hands, washed the vegetables, and prepared to cook. She wouldn't starve to death if she couldn't eat the dinner Immerse made himself. Although her cooking was much worse than his, she could eat. When she was in Cambodia, the little brothers of 11 Base all enjoyed the food she made. It didn't take long for Jean Wan to cook 2 bowls of noodles. After all, it was getting late, and it would be a waste of time to cook other dishes. Cooking noodles was the fastest. After cooking, she put the chopped green onions, coriander, eggs, and other seasonings on one of the bowls into a lovely heart shape, and then went to the study with the heart-shaped bowl. She gently knocked on the door twice and went in. Immerse was reading company documents. Jean Wan didn't disturb him. She walked over and put the bowl more than 20 centimeters away from his hand, then turned to look at his cold and silent profile while he was busy working, and whispered, "I cooked noodles. Have some." The man didn't respond, but she knew he heard her. She didn't say anything more, turned to go out, and gently closed the door of the study. No one accompanied her. At worst, she would eat alone. Jean Wan quickly ate up her bowl of noodles, then took the initiative to clean up the kitchen, the refrigerator, and cut some fruit to eat. She cut the other half of the fruit and put it on another plate, planning to give it to Immerse when he came out. After all, it was not convenient to go in and disturb him. After taking a shower, Jean Wan went to find a book to read. The man still didn't come out of the study, so she quietly read on the sofa in the living room. She seemed to have lived such a peaceful life before, in Aolan International, in the U Garden, in Tea City, not long ago. 1 life, 2 people, 3 meals, 4 seasons. In fact, this simplest and most ordinary life was the greatest happiness. The sky gradually darkened, and the rain outside stopped. There was not much rain in spring, but tonight's rain could be considered to have cooperated with Jean Wan. It continued to rain when needed, and even in the dead of night, it became quiet, no longer making people's heads hurt. It was already past 12 o'clock at night. The lights in the living room were turned off, and there was only a floor lamp by the sofa. A light fell on her from the top of her head. Jean Wan turned the page of the book in her hand and turned to look at the door of the study. The dinner was sent in at 8 o'clock. It should be reasonable for her to go in and take the bowl at this time. It shouldn't be a bother, right? She put down the book, got up from the sofa, went to the door of the study, and listened to the movement inside. She didn't know if Mo Jingshan had finished his work and was resting in the study, or he was still busy. There was no bed in the study of Aolan International, only a long sofa. Was he going to sleep in the study because she was here? There was more than 1 bedroom in Aolan International. He didn't have to suffer so much. Jean Wan gently pushed the door open and saw that the light in the study was still on. The man who had been reading the documents of the company was still reading the documents in front of the computer and didn't pay attention to the sound of the study door being pushed open by her again. "Why aren't you sleeping?" Jean Wan asked in a low voice. Knowing that he wouldn't answer her, Jean Wan didn't wait for him to answer. She glanced at the table beside his hand and found that he hadn't eaten the bowl of noodles she sent in a few hours ago. Chapter 376. And the noodles were cold and completely lumped together. He hadn't even touched them in the past few hours. Jean Wan suspected that he didn't even look at the bowl of noodles she brought in, let alone touch it or eat it. Even if he was hungry, he didn't intend to eat the food she made. Was it really so hard to cross the gap of 10 years between them? Jean Wan didn't speak but just looked at the man's back. She abruptly walked over, picked up the bowl of cold noodles, and turned to leave without saying a word. However, when she walked out of the study, she didn't control her strength, and the door of the study was slammed shut with a loud bang. The hand of the man in the study paused on the mouse for a moment. Then, without a trace, he continued with his previous work. Just 10 minutes later, the man got up and walked out of the study, just because he heard the sound of food. When he opened the door, he saw that Jean Wan had put the bowl of cold and lumped noodles on the coffee table. She sat on the sofa, holding a pair of chopsticks and lowering her head to eat seriously. "What are you doing?" This was probably the first time Mo Jingshan had taken the initiative to speak to her since he woke up from his 2-month sleep. But there was still no warmth in his voice. Jean Wan silently ate the bowl of cold and now quite unpalatable noodles. She ignored him and continued to pick up the noodles that could no longer be connected and stuffed them into her mouth. Mo Jingshan looked at her darkly, walked over, and moved the bowl of noodles away from her eyes. "The noodles are cold. What else do you want to eat? Are you deliberately making things difficult for your stomach?" Jean Wan's expression was indifferent. She raised her hand to wipe the soup stains on the corner of her mouth and looked up at him. "Even if you don't eat, your stomach is fine. I just ate a few bites of cold noodles. What can I do? Am I so fragile? I cooked the food you don't want to eat. If you don't want to eat it, I'll eat it myself." The man looked at her with almost incomprehensible eyes. Seeing Jean Wan's firm expression, he frowned coldly, threw away the bowl of noodles, and didn't let her eat anymore. The noodles were gone, but Jean Wan didn't say much. She put the chopsticks on the coffee table and sat on the sofa watching the man throw the empty bowl on the table. "Mo Jingshan, are you afraid that I'll have a stomachache from eating something cold? Are you feeling sorry for me?" she asked. The man didn't look at her. Some of the soup had splashed on his hand. He pulled out a tissue from the coffee table and wiped his hands expressionlessly. At the same time, he said expressionlessly, "I don't want you to get a stomach problem and call the doctor tomorrow morning because of a stomachache. It'll waste my time. Is it so hard to admit that you can't let go of me?" Jean Wan stared at her. A mocking smile appeared on the man's expressionless face. He coldly glanced at her. "It's a disease to think too highly of yourself. Jean Wan, you're seriously ill." "Probably." "He is seriously ill," Wang Yao said. Jean Wan leaned back on the sofa and looked at him. "You're so cold and heartless to me, but I feel that you love me very much." The man's face could no longer be described as expressionless. Instead, there was a deeper coldness and determination. The air fell into a strange silence. The man didn't speak, and neither did Jean Wan. There was a gust of wind blowing outside the window. As the wind blew past the window, the sound of the wind could be heard, blowing away this unusual silence. "It's 1 a.m. He didn't look at her. He said softly and indifferently, "Turn off the lights and go back to the bedroom to sleep." If she listened carefully, she could hear the coldness of ice shards falling to the ground from his words that sounded like he was concerned about her. This man was really, Jean Wan couldn't help but wonder if he would be overjoyed when he heard the news when she was framed and thrown into prison after 10 years of wandering, instead of suddenly appearing in prison the moment she vomited blood and died, as she had once dreamed. Perhaps a dream was really just a dream. His attitude seemed to be that he hated her to the bone. He hadn't appeared for 10 years. How could he have any extra thoughts about her life and death? He was just someone unrelated to her. Just like right now, she seemed to be someone unrelated to him. "When will you sleep?" Jean Wan leaned against the sofa and didn't move. Mo Jingshan said indifferently without raising his eyes, "I'll rest when I want to sleep. You don't need to worry about this." But I want you to sleep with me in your arms. Jean Wan looked at his face and said sincerely, like before. Mo Jingshan frowned and turned to look at her coldly. Now you even take the initiative to humiliate yourself? Jean Wan looked at his face under the dim light of the floor lamp and said frankly and sincerely, you always like to sleep with me in your arms. The man's smile was cold. He indifferently curved his lips, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That's the Mo Jingshan from 10 months ago, not me. Jean Wan abruptly got up and walked toward him. The dark night always gave people inexplicably courage. She wanted to hug him, or let him hug her. Since he woke up, he didn't even want to touch her hand, let alone be hugged. Maybe if she hugged him, he would be moved. If she hugged him, he would come back, and he wouldn't be like this again. However, before she approached, Mo Jingshan didn't speak. As if he had seen through her purpose, he turned away when her hand was about to touch him and entered the study without looking back. The light from the only floor lamp in the living room lengthened her shadow and cast a long shadow on the ground. Jean Wan looked at the door of the study that was closed again and stood there for a while. Then she felt a gradual pain in her stomach. Mo Jingshan did know her well. She was a person who could endure any disaster and survive. However, a small cold, a small fever, or even a period could make her suffer just because she ate something cold. The bowl of noodles just now was cold and sticky. She really shouldn't have eaten it. She raised her hand to cover her stomach. After standing for a while, she couldn't stand it anymore. She turned back to the sofa and sat down. She curled up on the sofa and covered her increasingly painful stomach with her hand. The door of the study was closed and there was no sound. The living room was also so quiet that it felt a little lonely. Jean Wan endured the pain in her stomach and raised her eyes. The tears that were forced back into her eyes blurred her vision. Looking at the light of the floor lamp, she curled up on the sofa uncomfortably. It hurt, but she asked for it. When she ate those noodles just now, she didn't know if she was a little irrational and masochistic. Would his heart ache? The truth was, he didn't intend to care about her. He personally spoiled her into such a delicate little princess, but in the end, he cruelly pushed her back into the cold cage and ignored her. You're tuning in to the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.